debut of Bloomberg This Weekend live special coverage this morning from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo, and there's really only one story this morning, and that is Iran. Early this morning, before we came on the air, the U.S. and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran. Iran has retaliated. Those strikes are ongoing, and here's the latest.
Breaking news on this Saturday morning. President Trump says the U.S. has launched major combat operations in Iran.
It's been mass terror, and we're not going to put up with it any longer.
Airstrikes have been carried out by the U.S. and Israel. In a taped message, President Trump says he's calling on Iranians to overthrow the regime. And the president warns Americans could die as a result of the operation.
The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties.
This morning, Iran retaliates, saying there are no red lines and all targets are on the table. We're tracking reports of various strikes on or around the Middle East. We're going to get started on this morning with the latest, and for that we go to Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
President Donald Trump, he is urging Iranians right now over the government to withdraw, to take over that government. This is once that military campaign, it comes to an end. So let's get right to it. He said the military operation began after Iran refused to renounce nuclear weapons. Here's what we know so far. Several large explosions reported in the capital, Tehran. Now the response. Sirens sounded throughout Israel. Iran state media said Tehran launched a wave of missile and drone attacks on Israel. Israel's army also reported missile launches from Iran. Israel's military said its defense systems were operating to intercept any attack. Strikes are ongoing. Israel media reporting a new wave of missile attacks by Iran on southern Israel. Now, Israel defense minister, it is declaring a state of emergency in the country. What we also want to tell you about is U.S. embassies in Bahrain, in Qatar have issued shelter-in-place orders as well for all of its personnel, but also for U.S. citizens in the area. Now I want to get to the airspace and give you the latest on that. Israel, Iran, they have closed their airspace. The UAE has enacted a partial closure of its airspace as a precautionary measure. And Bloomberg Intelligence aviation defense analyst Erik saying that travelers can expect some severe disruptions in the area to Asia, Europe air traffic. The U.S. Navy advised ships already in the area as well. Exercise extreme caution. Be prepared to respond to any queries. Now, at that same note, at the same time, we're now hearing a bit more on Bahrain, where Iran semi-official TASM reporting that Iranian missile attacks targeted a U.S. base there. No further details of that are available. If we go to our latest update straight from the blog, after explosions were heard in Kuwait, the national oil company issued a statement saying refining and production are proceeding without interruption. David and Christina, though, it's not clear where, when, even if President Trump will speak. He is at his Mar-a-Lago resort over in Florida.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And as you were speaking, our control room is telling me that Qatar says they have intercepted a third wave of missiles. We'll have more for you on that when we get it. We do have global coverage for you this morning with reporters and analysts from Washington to Tel Aviv and beyond. But first, we want to play you some of the messages that President Trump delivered this morning in the very early hours of the morning. He posted that direct to social media.
We sought repeatedly to make a deal. We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces and no longer use their IEDs or roadside bombs, as they are sometimes called, to so gravely wound and kill thousands and thousands of people, including many Americans. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. This regime will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States Armed Forces.
Just part of an extraordinary 8-minute statement the president posted on Truth Social in the early hours of this morning. We'll play more of it here over the course of the hour, but I want to bring in our guests to start the show. We've got Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for the Middle East and Africa, Ethan Bronner, Bloomberg's Israel bureau chief, Joumanna Bercetche, Bloomberg Horizon's Middle East and Africa anchor, and here with us on set in New York, Jeff Mason, Bloomberg's White House correspondent, and Joe Mathieu, co-anchor of Balance of Power. Jeff Mason, let me start with you and this extraordinary turn of events. We saw the diplomatic track going apace, meetings taking place in Geneva. What do we know of why the president made this decision when he did?
Well, a couple things from listening to him speak today. I think, number one, he's, in addition to announcing the news of what the decision that he made, he was also making a bit of a sales pitch to the American people and to his political base, talking about why he was doing it, going all the way back to the decades in terms of the relationship between Iran and the United States and the tension that's been there. Also presenting himself as the president who was willing to do this and comparing himself to other presidents. That's also very much his MO when he makes big decisions. I don't think you can underclub how big of a thing this is for President Trump and for his presidency. This is a major military operation. It carries huge political risks for him, and big political risks for the military as well. The last thing I would say along those lines, if a president of the United States comes out and warns Americans there may be casualties of U.S. troops, there's a reason. And there are multiple questions he hasn't answered in terms of, has he changed his mind about ground troops? Does he have thinking beyond the assets that are already in that region? Those are questions that we're going to be asking. But the fact that he flagged it means he's preparing the United States for a longer war.
The other thing that really stood out to me is openly calling for regime change. So, I mean, that's not something we hear a lot from U.S. presidents. Previously, he spoke to the American people, but he also spoke directly to the Iranian people, saying, stay sheltered, don't leave your homes, bombs will be dropping everywhere when we are finished, take over your government, it will be yours to take. This is probably your only chance for generations. What's your reaction?
Remembering that the original justification for military action was to protect the protesters. Remember, help was on its way. That was weeks ago. Since then, tens of thousands have been killed, and so there's a big question about exactly how this is going to be received on the ground. I will say that for anyone who wondered if Bloomberg TV and radio needed a weekend show, not asking that question any longer, and I thank you both for bringing this to air. You're in the right place at the right time, and we're going to be watching congressional reaction as lawmakers start to wake up. It does appear the president has the support of Roger Wicker, of course, the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, but there's a War Powers resolution that's waiting for a vote. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey, just this morning, just a short time ago on Twitter, the Senate should vote on Senator Kane's War Powers resolution immediately. I stand ready to do so today. There will be a call to bring that to the floor as soon as next week.
And the minority leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, telling us yesterday, Christina, that they intend to vote on that in the House this week. Seeing news here that Oman's foreign minister addressing the U.S. says, quote, this is not your war. Let's go to Joumanna Bercetche now in Dubai. And Joumanna, in the run-up to this, we heard from the Supreme Leader that any attack on Iran would kick off a regional conflagration, a regional war. Seems like we're seeing that here. Give us the latest that you're hearing and seeing in Dubai.
Well, it's a really tense day. We woke up in the morning with nothing having happened overnight. And I think the assumption when we went to sleep yesterday was that if there was going to be military action, it would happen in the evening, which is what happened with the 12-day Iran-Israel war a year ago in last June. But actually, this time was a little bit different because in the early hours of the morning, it seemed as though Israel had launched those attacks on Iran. Several explosions were heard in Tehran and around the other parts of the country as well. Shortly afterwards, afterwards, the U.S. confirmed that they had also participated in those operations as well. And not so long after that, you got a very swift Iranian response. And again, this is another big difference to the last big war, the 12-day war. It took a couple of days for Iran to orchestrate their response. This time around, they were ready to go, and they fired back at U.S. bases dotted around the Gulf. And here I'm talking about Qatar, about Bahrain, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, with explosions heard in various of those bases. Even citizens were receiving siren warnings, alerts on their phones, and notifying them that an attack was imminent. Now, from what we understand, most of the missiles and drones that were fired and directed at the Gulf states and at these bases were intercepted. We've heard of one casualty in Abu Dhabi, but probably on back of shrapnel. But I should say that the strikes are ongoing as we speak. We just heard of another strike being directed towards Doha and also at Iraq and some of the bases there in Iraq as well. So I think it's fair to say that this was never going to be a just U.S.-Iran war. There was always going to be the risk of a broader regional involvement, and we're very much in the middle of that right now with the attacks on Israel and the attacks on these various U.S. bases in the Gulf, too.
Well, and that was the concern with Gulf allies, and even folks who are close to the president were really hoping that cooler heads could prevail, because a conflict between these two countries is unlikely to stay between those two countries. As you mentioned, we're seeing reports of hits throughout the region. We're still trying to assess those as those trickle in. A lot of video on social media. We're going to verify that as we can and try to get to you. Ethan, I want to go to you because, like many people here this morning, my phone rang at about 1:30 a.m. with a source in Tel Aviv telling me they didn't know what was happening. Nothing had hit yet, but they were getting those red alerts on their phone. Take shelter. This is proactive. Something is imminent. Can you kind of walk us through your morning, what you heard and what you saw, and how this kind of unraveled on the ground?
Certainly. So at that exact hour, we had sirens going off. I'm here in Tel Aviv. It was 8:30 our time. And I'm now in my safe room, which is a part of my apartment. It's reinforced concrete, and it's got a metal for the window and a metal door and so on. This is obviously, if a missile hits my building, I'm not going to survive. But anything sort of 100 meters away or so, the impact I'll be protected from. So people across the country who have access to such a place are in it. Many thousands of people are in sort of subway systems and underground parking areas and so on. There's been all day long sirens here at the north and the south. So far, according to Israeli officials, at least in the last hour that I've heard, there are only about 40 missiles that have landed here. And there's a range of predictions about how bad it will get. I just was listening to one analyst say this is just the beginning. They're going to have cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and drones. It's going to go on and it's going to get rough. That could well be. Others are saying that the reason Israel and the U.S. chose to attack now is because the Iranians had suffered quite a lot in June and couldn't rebuild enough to really come back at these guys. We shall see. But it is certainly a very big day in this conflict, and there is no question that they're now talking relatively openly about regime change and sort of asserting that these attacks are going to encourage Iranians to rise up again in the streets. It's obviously a controversial notion. Typically, when foreign powers attack a country, people rally around the flag rather than against their own government. But the calculation here is that it might be otherwise this time.
Paul Wallace, let me turn to you in London. Again, you head up our Middle East coverage, and I'm curious what you're hearing with the sense that we have of how long this might progress or play out. And we've seen the Iranian foreign minister call for a meeting of the UN Security Council to try to get some sense internationally of what's going to happen here going forward. What's the latest on the sense of timetable?
I mean, the sense is that this cannot be a short, days-long campaign if Trump is sincere when he is effectively calling for regime change, calling for Iranians to take over their government when they get the opportunity. So if that is his aim, and we listened, obviously you played clips of his video from Mar-a-Lago, him talking about destroying Iran's navy, destroying its ballistic missile program completely. If that is his aim, then he's not going to be able to achieve that in a matter of days. So we could be looking at something that takes more than a week, perhaps even several weeks. That's the thinking, that this is bigger than looks bigger than what we saw last year in June when Israel struck Iran and started a 12-day war, which the US joined right at the end.
Joumanna, I want to go back to you, because one of the questions that we had going into this is the Trump administration made a bold claim and said they had already essentially destroyed Iran's nuclear sites in that last attack. So what are the targets? What were they going after in Tehran? Do we know what they hit or what they were aiming for? And I also want to ask your take on this call for regime change in Tehran. The U.S. does not have a great history there. Do we have any indication it could be more successful the second time around?
Well, let me just start with the first part of the question, which is what we understand. The first wave of strikes were actually directed towards personnel, intelligence officials, the intelligence headquarters, less so military infrastructure. But as the day progressed, it seemed as though the later strikes by Israel were also targeting some of the military infrastructure as well. From the morning strikes, though, we understand that they targeted Isfahan, which is a key area, one of those key locations within Iran where they do have nuclear centrifuges. They still have the capabilities at some point in the future of firing them up. And I think that is also very pertinent to the discussion, because we had even reported, Bloomberg, we put up a piece about this earlier this week, about satellite imagery suggesting that Iran were looking to reconstitute part of that nuclear reactor system in Isfahan. So it seems as though that was one of the sites. Now, in terms of who's being accounted for and who's not being accounted for, what we understand so far, and this is per, again, the news that is put forward by the semi-official Iranian news agencies, but the President Pezeshkian has been accounted for, the foreign minister has been accounted for. We don't know yet about the supreme leader himself, Khamenei, and whether he is fully safe or whether he has been injured. So again, this is something that everyone is watching for very closely for confirmation. But I think what's clear is from President Trump's speech overnight, the video that he posted, and he's expected to speak, I think, in the next couple of hours, perhaps to give it a little bit more color on what they're trying to achieve here. It is something more than what they went for in Operation Hammer last year, which was a surgical limited strike on those nuclear facilities. He is directly speaking to the people. This is what Ethan was just saying as well, and really sees this as an opportunity for perhaps more intrinsic change. Now, when it comes to regime change, it's one of those things where it's easier said than done. And I think within Iran, there is an understanding as well. That, don't forget the Ayatollah is 86 years old. They have been preparing for the possibility of him no longer being there. So they have actually thought about a series of successors and what to do with the governance structure should he no longer exist. It's not so easy as removing a figurehead and replacing it with someone else and then cutting a deal with the new leadership is similar to the Venezuela model. I think it's a much more challenging set of circumstances. It's a population of almost 90 million. It's not a homogenous population. And at the same time, you do have a chunk of more than 100,000, 200,000 security forces that are very aligned and ideologically opposed to putting a deal with the United States.
Jeff, I want to get more into what the president's thinking is going into this, what it's going to be going forward. And you brought up just a moment ago how he's talked about the gravity of U.S. forces getting involved. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about that in that statement that he posted online.
My administration has taken every possible step to minimize the risk to U.S. personnel in the region. Even so, and I do not make this statement lightly, the Iranian regime seeks to kill. The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now. We're doing this for the future, and it is a noble mission.
I mean, that's really remarkable.
It is really remarkable. And Jeff, I'm curious sort of how he has and is going to continue making that case to the American people. We all listened to the State of the Union just a couple of days ago, and Iran had really, in the broad scope of that 2-hour speech, kind of a glancing mention. But this is really ratcheting it up, and I think that we've all talked about over the last few weeks what the administration's objectives are here when it comes to Iran. Now that we have these remarks from the president, now that we've seen what's happened on the ground, it's continuing to happen on the ground, your sense of how this has evolved and what appetite, if any, the American public has for this kind of adventurism in the Middle East right now?
Well, I can tell you his political base doesn't have appetite for it, and that I think when I was referring to political risk at the top of the show, that's one of the big questions for him. The president and the country is heading into midterm elections this November. The White House, particularly his chief of staff, has wanted him to be focused on the economy. He was in Texas just yesterday talking about the economy, talking about energy. There was a lot of concern in the last few months among folks around him and amongst his political base that he was spending too much time on foreign policy. Here he is now making a choice to start a war. And let's be clear, this is not just the United States supporting Israel at war with Iran. This is a U.S. war, and he's using that language. He's talking about potential casualties, as we've already said. This is not just supporting an ally. This is being part of it and being the aggressor. And also, again, going back to that sales pitch, talking about why and suggesting that the United States might have been at risk because of the missile technology that Iran was developing. So I think you're going to continue to hear that. I think he's going to continue making his case. But the risks, again, not just political, but certainly to lives. And listening to Ethan talk about just the safety measures that he has to take in Israel right now, we just don't know what's going to happen in terms of in terms of potential lives lost, both from our allies and from American troops as well.
Joe, the other part of this is, we've been tracking these negotiations in Geneva, indirect talks. So basically, the U.S. is in one room, Iran is in the other. The Omanis are going back and forth. And the messaging coming out of that meeting from the Omanis, who spoke to our colleagues over at CBS at Face the Nation this week, was that this was going well, that they had somewhat of an agreement. And one of the things they said that they had agreed to, Iran agreed to, is to give up their nuclear weapons program. And that was progress, because even in the JCPOA, that was not stated in that clear of terms. It was all about enrichment, enriching it to a certain level. That seemed like a big hurdle that had been overcome, and then they were scheduled to do technical talks, and then this strike happened. What is your take on that? Was the U.S. ever really serious about these negotiations in Geneva?
That's such a great question, and maybe no one knows outside of Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Donald Trump. They thought they were on the precipice of something that could amount to a breakthrough, and indeed, there was a session planned for next week, but this has been kind of the MO for Trump, right? 10 or 15 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is, we've got a meeting on the books, and then missiles start flying. That's obviously the timing of his choice here, but this is going to get more difficult potentially with each day. As Jeff points out, politically speaking here, this is about duration as well. Politically, how this plays, what's Steve Bannon going to be saying in 3 months about this? What are MAGA candidates post-primaries going to be saying on the campaign trail? Republicans are trying to maintain a majority on Capitol Hill, and many Republicans have no appetite to be starting a new war. Add that to this extended deployment that we're seeing for the USS Gerald Ford. Has been at sea for 11 months. They're having plumbing problems. Sailors are in line for the bathroom. This is not good for morale. If you look at the analysis by Bloomberg Intelligence, what we're paying on a daily basis here to maintain just these two carrier strike groups, the United States, salaries, gas, amounts to almost $30 million a day. That's before a missile is shot.
These were strikes that were carried out by the U.S. and Israel. We should put a fine point on that. Emphasize that once again. And before I turn back to you again, Ethan Bronner, let's take a listen to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on the heels of these first strikes this morning.
A short while ago, Israel and the United States launched a joint campaign, Operation Lion's Roar. The objective of the operation is to put an end to the threat from the Ayatollah regime in Iran. At this time, the IDF is attacking targets of the oppressive regime, facilities of the Revolutionary Guard, along with the United States military, targeting ballistic missile sites that threaten both Israel and US forces. The operation will continue as long as necessary.
Ethan, I asked Jeff Mason about how the president's thinking on this has evolved, how he got to this point. Let me ask you about how the president was convinced by Prime Minister Netanyahu's feelings about this. We saw Prime Minister Netanyahu in the U.S. just a few days ago meeting with the president, as we understand it, conveying to him that he was not enthusiastic about the U.S. pursuing these diplomatic talks with Iran in Switzerland. Talk a bit about that evolution and the case that he was making to the president and how we got to this point from your vantage.
Sure. Look, I think it's important. In the Middle East, in this place where I'm living right now, the idea of war is not considered the worst thing that can happen, okay? The survival of that government is considered, in Iran, is considered a much more dangerous long-term situation than a relatively short-term war. I'm not offering my view, the view of the people here. And there's no doubt that President Trump seems to have agreed that the future of the United States and its allies is better served by doing this. I mean, I understand that within the United States it feels like a deeply political question, but here it feels like a geostrategic one in the same way that he took out Maduro in Venezuela. The idea is that if you are a rich country that is an enemy, this is something that the United States under Trump wants to do something about. So there's no question that from Israel's perspective, you have billions of dollars spent by Iran on its proxies, the Houthis and Hezbollah, Hamas, and don't forget, of course, October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel so brutally. So from Israel's perspective, to get rid of Iran, this Iranian regime is so clearly in the interest of it and of the United States. And that's obviously the case that he made to the president. In this country, by the way, it was not a difficult case to make. He is not alone. This is not a Bibi problem. Much of this country is grateful for the United States to be doing this. I don't know if it's probably a majority, but it's certainly not a minority.
I just want to tell our audience on YouTube and television and digital, the video you're seeing right now is from the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces. Paul, I want to ask you, we're still trying to sort out exactly the level of coordination between the U.S. and Israel. I'm looking at some top lines from our reporting teams in the terminal here, and we're reporting the strikes on Iran were planned for many weeks, with the U.S. and Israel leading different aspects of the attack, according to an Israeli military official. If that's the case and these strikes have been planned out for many weeks, that goes back to my previous question, was the U.S. ever negotiating in good faith with Iran?
That's a big question, and there have always been plenty of doubts about how sincere the U.S. was being when it said it did want the talks to run their course and for the talks to be given a chance. I mean, both things can be right. Obviously, there was military planning going on in the background. I mean, let's face it, there would have been military planning going on at least since the June 12-day war by Israel and also the U.S. And even then, it would have been, just on top of the existing military planning that took that took place. And even while these talks were going on, the U.S. was obviously building up a huge number of forces in the Middle East region. It now has, with these two aircraft carrier groups there and a very large number of warplanes and refueling planes and stuff stationed across the region. It now has its biggest expeditionary force in place anywhere since the 2003 Iraq invasion. So a lot of people are saying, well, why would you do that if you didn't plan to use it in some way? And there certainly will be people questioning Trump with regards to that. Iran itself would not have been taken completely by surprise by the strikes this morning. It's warned, long warned that it would be ready at a moment's notice to retaliate against U.S. strikes, and that has proved correct with a very swift number of counter strikes on Israel and the likes of U.S. bases in Qatar and Bahrain and the UAE and things. But yes, there will be a lot of people just wondering whether the talks in essence were a sham to lull Iran into some kind of sense of complacency, and there will be people saying, well, Trump planned these strikes all along, or at least since around a month ago when he told the Iranian people during the height of the protests that help was at hand.
Joumanna, let me turn to you on this issue of dueling existentialism. You have the Prime Minister of Israel really couching this in existential terms. They have to take out this Iranian regime. And then you look at the rhetoric from the Iranian regime this morning. They're characterizing this as existential as well. This fight will be existential.
Saying nothing is off limits. All targets are on the table.
Absolutely. And I wonder if you could just talk about the perils of that, having these two powers really thinking about this in those terms.
Yeah, and I also want to go back to the question that you asked, Paul, which is whether the U.S. were engaging in these conversations in good faith. I would also ask the same out of the Iranians and whether the Iranians were actually engaging these negotiations with full faith of getting to a deal. And the fact that they were able to respond so quickly this morning means that they, too, were preparing militarily for the possibility of an attack. So, both sides were very, very aware that the possibility of the very acute possibility that there was not going to be a breakthrough on those discussions, which is interesting given the rhetoric that came out of the Omani Foreign Ministry and the mediator yesterday. But I would say from the Iranian perspective, look, there's no denying that they are in a much weaker position than they were a year ago, possibly the weakest they've been since they took over in 1979. And this is an existential situation for them because just a couple of months ago, we were talking about the possibility of internal regime change because of the sheer amount of demonstrations that were taking place. The protesters, they were brutally put down by the regime. And that's actually the origin for why President Trump was so focused on the Iranian file again. Once again this year, originally the purpose was to bring help, or we're sending help to the demonstrators on the streets. It obviously has evolved since then into something a little bit more than that, and a full, complete regime change. Now, the Iranians wanted one thing, which is survival, but obviously intrinsic to that is the sanctions relief, because the sanctions have been crippling the economy. And the nexus of many of those demonstrations is because the economy is on its heels right now. You're talking about rampant inflation, GDP that's in a state of decline, very unhappy younger population, rising unemployment as well. And so there was a lot of sociological pressure on the regime. But at the same time, ideologically, what underpins their philosophy is this quote-unquote resistance. And that is key to what they created or tried to create over the last couple of decades, the so-called axis of resistance in the region, opposed to the very existence of Israel. The same security officials that will regularly chant death to America. And so for them, having access to that arsenal of ballistic missiles and having the capability to actually fire up their nuclear weapons should they need to do so is intrinsic to their identity.
And Joumanna,
so this is where this essential topic.
Really quick, we want to tell our audience the Associated Press is saying one of the strikes took place near the office of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. That's pretty significant. We're not sure exactly what the results of those strikes were, but as that reporting comes in, it looks like that has been confirmed that at least some of those strikes have landed close to that facility.
Joe, let me turn to you again. You brought this up at the top. You invoked this conversation about war powers, and we've talked a bit here about the legacy of what happened in Venezuela, the earlier attack that we saw on Iran. I'm curious what you're going to be listening for here from lawmakers on this Saturday morning as you consult your Truth Social and X feeds just to see what they're saying. Are you at all optimistic that there's going to be anything kind of a coalescing message in opposition to this that's different from what we've seen in those past two incidents?
Well, whether that equals optimism, I think the question will be, will there be a Republican jailbreak? Because the war powers resolution will likely get to the floor. And we understand, by the way, that Speaker Mike Johnson is going to be issuing a statement probably within the confines of this program at some point this morning. That'll give us a sense of where his mind is on this. But he and John Thune have been talking to a number of lawmakers, beginning with Tim Kaine in the Senate. We spoke with a couple of members of the House about this recently, including Don Bacon, who have signed up, and Congressman Morelli of New York. There are a couple of different pieces of legislation that could lead us here. But keep in mind, we saw hands full of Republicans cross the aisle on things like ACA, healthcare premiums, more recently on tariffs. Is there a MAGA-friendly group of Republicans, i.e. Freedom Caucus, that does not want to see this war get underway? I would suggest yes. It's just going to be a question of numbers.
And this is also different than a targeted strike. What it sounds like from the president is this is going to be a much longer campaign. As we have all discussed, that's the last thing people who are looking at the midterms want ahead of those midterms when they're trying to keep focused on affordability and domestic issues.
An authorization of a use of force is likely justified in this case if we're talking about something of duration, and it sounds that's like exactly what the president is talking about.
And Jeff, really quickly here, we heard Joumanna say there's been some reporting here of the president speaking. Your sense from your reporting, if that's likely to happen in the coming hours or today, was, as I say, an extraordinary statement we saw the president post online, and I'm curious if perhaps he would be contentious to let that speak for itself here in the hours ahead.
So a couple of things. I think it's important to note that that statement that we've seen was one that he, as you said, posted. He did not speak in front of a group of reporters. That was not live. So far, I'm not expecting him to do any live comments this morning, but he could always do another statement like that.
All right, we're going to say goodbye here to Paul Wallace, joining us from London, Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai, Ethan Bronner, our Israel bureau chief, joining us from his safe room in Tel Aviv. Ethan, please stay safe. Joumanna, you as well. Our coverage is going to continue here with Joe and Jeff on set.
We'll have much more. We're going to dig into some of the congressional reaction when we come back.
Joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with our top story. And the U.S. and Israel have launched an attack on Iran. Multiple provinces have been hit. Now, in an 8-minute video posted to Truth Social, the president said the objective was to defend the American people.
It has always been the policy of the United States, in particular, my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon.
The sources tell Bloomberg the U.S.-Israeli strikes have already targeted senior officials, air defenses, as well as missile sites that could strike the Persian Gulf. President Trump, he urged Iranians to take over the government once a military campaign comes to an end. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu echoing President Trump, saying that the joint strikes aim to remove an existential threat and that Iran must be denied access to nuclear weapons. He also made a direct call on Iranians to remove leaders of their regime. Now, Israel reported missile launches from Iran. Tehran also targeted a U.S. base in Bahrain. Explosions heard in Kuwait and Qatar, downing an Iranian missile. Qatar and the UAE said they intercepted attacks on their territory. Explosions also heard in Dubai. I want to go to the live blog right now. And Russia's foreign ministry there calling the attack on Iran, quote, a pre-planned and unprovoked act of armed aggression that violated international law. We'll continue to keep you updated throughout the morning as updates do come in. David, Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. David Gura with Christina Ruffini. Looking at that live blog that Lisa just mentioned, hugely helpful in a moment like this. You can find it at Bloomberg.com or, of course, on the terminal. And we're seeing here, Iran appears to be delegating some powers to local authorities to keep the state functioning amid these attacks. That's attributed to the state news service there in Iran. Again, we're trying to get a holistic picture here of what the situation is on the ground in Iran in the wake of these strikes.
And that's really interesting because there's a long-standing question about command and control with different pockets of the Iranian government, especially the IRGC. So here, they're actively delegating control, and that command decision to different groups is interesting and would be concerning if I were at a U.S. installation in the Middle East right now.
Going to keep tracking that, of course, as we look to how this is playing domestically here in the United States. We're going to go to Mar-a-Lago, where the president is, and recorded that statement that was released last night in the early morning hours, and to Washington as well. Several members of Congress waking up early, as we all did, I think, to get a sense here of what's happened and weighing in on what happened as well. Christina.
We want to go to Courtney Subramanian, who's Bloomberg's White House correspondent and is in Mar-a-Lago with the president, and Erik Wasson, who's our congressional reporter, who is in D.C. Courtney, I want to start with you because we're a little bit confused about how this all went down. It seems like this video just popped up. I'm wondering, normally there's procedure for this. Normally a statement of this level of consequence where the president is saying the word war to the American public and the world is done in front of reporters. Were any journalists in that room? How were you informed that this video had posted? Was the pool gathered at all?
We were informed just like everyone else. We woke up to the news in the middle of the night. We had not been informed that the president was going to record this video. We're still waiting to hear from the White House. Our call time to gather for us to go over to Mar-a-Lago has been pushed back twice so far. We haven't heard from them about any plans for a press conference. It seems that they are so far letting the message that the president delivered on video play out at this point.
Erik Wasson, I want to play a bit of tape. We sat down with the minority leader in the House yesterday, Hakeem Jeffries, Christina, and I, and in the context of that conversation, asked him about the prospects of the U.S. going to war and the plans that he has made public for there to be a vote on this Ro Khanna, Thomas Massie-sponsored War Powers resolution. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, and I'll ask a couple questions about it on the other side.
Yeah, well, what we have to do as the Article 1 branch of government is reclaim our authority as a separate and co-equal branch, which unfortunately our Republican colleagues have declined to do. In fact,
so how can you do that?
Well, we can do it by beginning to actually bring legislation to the floor that is consistent with the values of our framers. They gave the House of Representatives the authority as it relates to appropriations because they knew taxation and spending were particularly important, and the House was the closest institution to the people. They also gave us the authority as it relates to trade and tariffs, and they gave us the authority as it relates to the power to declare war. And unfortunately, over time, we've seen an erosion of Congress exercising that authority. And our commitment on behalf of the American people is to regain that.
But can you do anything to stop a president who decides to take military action like this?
We have to do everything that we can on behalf of the American people, because the American people clearly know that the last thing we need at this moment, when they literally are struggling, having to choose between paying rent, buying groceries, or getting to go see a doctor when they need one, this is unacceptable in this country. And the last thing we need is another failed foreign forever war, which certainly would be the outcome if Donald Trump decides to get us entangled in Iran and the Middle East.
Comments there from the minority leader in the House, I should say, from yesterday before the president launched these attacks. And Erik Wasson, I know you've been sifting through all the social media posts and reaching out to congressional offices for reaction here. And you hear the civics lesson that the minority leader made there at the top, I think would strike a lot of Americans as novel in light of what we've seen recently. How has the conversation shifted on the Hill in the few hours that the sun has been up in Washington, D.C.?
Well, so far we're seeing the predictable reaction from the left and the right. We haven't really heard from the center yet, which I'm most interested in. We have the Progressive Caucus calling for an immediate vote on the War Powers resolution. Tim Kaine as well calling for a Senate immediate vote. Basically these Democrats point to what happened in the Venezuela situation, where there was a successful Senate vote on a Venezuela War Powers resolution initially, and then the Trump administration changed some of their tactics. They called off a second strike. They negotiated appearance by Marco Rubio before the Senate to explain himself. We're just seeing a statement from Marc Warner, the intelligence top Democrat in the Senate, saying we need to have a justification. The administration needs to come forward, fully brief Congress for starters, and say why they're doing this. The initial reaction is this midnight video in a golf hat by the president is really not sufficient justification. The State of the Union barely mentioned Iran. They want to hear more. And we're trying to find out if these votes will go forward next week, in the House and the Senate on a War Powers resolution. The president, of course, can veto it. The original version of the War Powers resolution, which was not able to be vetoed, was ruled unconstitutional. But it could put pressure on him to limit the strikes if there's a strong showing from Republicans saying, hey, we're not on board with this.
I suspect we'll be checking with both of you over the course of the morning. That's Erik Wasson, who covers the Hill for us here at Bloomberg News, and Courtney Subramanian, who covers the White House. She is in Mar-a-Lago with the president this weekend in the pool, covering his movements over the course of these next 2 days.
Thanks them both, and thank you for answering our emails at the very, very early hours of this morning. Joining us now, we have Michael Allen, who's a managing editor and partner at Beacon Global Strategies. He also served at the NSC under President George W. Bush. Michael, we want to start with you. I'm wondering what you think the aim of this strike was. There's a suggestion that this was an effort to decapitate Iran's leadership, which is something the U.S., has so far avoided in these strategic strikes. Why try to do that now, and do we think it would have been effective?
So I am a little surprised myself how explicit President Trump was in his remarks, calling out the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and trying to set the conditions for regime change. He went back to his original justification to get involved in Iran. Remember weeks ago when he said we were locked and loaded and ready to help the protesters. So I think it's remarkable that he said please, people, stay in your house for now, but when the bombing is over, you should go back and take out your government. So, in a sense, this is classic Trump. If you're going to go big, and that's what he's done.
Michael Allen, I'm curious sort of what this says to you about the evolution of this, the Iran project, the way that administrations successively have looked at Iran and the prospects for regime change there. There have been some who have hoped for it, some who've tried to action via sanctions and other means. There have some who've been agitating for this kind of military action. What does it say to you about that evolution that we saw this administration take this tack?
I think what's different this time is just the sheer state of the Iranian economy, plus widespread disaffection among every class and creed across the Islamic Republic. The protests, as you all are well aware, were the most broad-based in Iran's history, at least since 1979. So when you put together a restive public, a growing ballistic missile program, and a president who wants to do big things, and President Trump, I think, in general here, has used military force aggressively, I think that's what set the conditions for the United States getting involved and going big. I think it was a head fake when people leaked a few days ago that we were going to do symbolic strikes. He's going large. He's going after them. And with the help of Israel, I think they're really trying to get the supreme leader and decapitate the regime.
The Gulf allies are not friends of Iran necessarily either. This regime has been largely problematic for a lot of folks, even those who do have direct diplomatic relations with Tehran. But I'm wondering what this does for the U.S. position in the region, because the diplomats that I've spoken to from those countries really did not want this action for a couple reasons. They're not sure what comes after if this regime falls. There is no civil society in Iran. There is not allowed to be civil society in Iran. That structure does not yet exist. They are afraid of a power vacuum. They've seen that in other places, including Iraq and Afghanistan, and what that does for regional stability. I'm also wondering what that does for the U.S. relationships with these allies, because Iran is not just going to strike back against U.S. and Israeli installations, and even if they do, those are located in other countries, right? We've got Al Udeid base, one of the biggest in the area. That's in Qatar. We've got reports that naval operations in Bahrain were struck. What does this do for America's relationships with its Gulf allies?
So I think you're right. I think behind closed doors, these Arab allies of ours were not thrilled because, one, they're ready to move on to grow their economies. They're not interested in a big geopolitical fight around their region. Second, I think they want and value stability, not only for economic reasons, but for their own regimes. They don't like the example of popular uprisings toppling monarchies, if you will. So I do think that behind closed doors, they were not thrilled with this. They are not friends of Iran, however, and if things turn out to be a great scenario, I think they'll rejoice. But yeah, I think privately right now, they're worried about it. And as you know, Iran went big on retaliation this morning. They hit as many as 5 Arab countries. So Iran clearly views this as an existential threat. They're making good on their promises to attempt to regionalize the war. And I think that's another reason those Gulf states and others are uncomfortable.
I want to bring another Allen into this conversation. Retired General John Allen, of course, the former head of CENTCOM, joins us now. And General, I want to get your reaction to the military might that was marshaled to the Gulf ahead of these strikes. What you were thinking as that happened, and sort of how you're thinking through what the next stages of this might be. The conversation that we've been having has centered so much on how long this is likely to last, what the reaction is likely to be going forward. How are you thinking about those two things? The U.S.'s preparedness for this and the sense of how long it's going to be?
Well, I think it'll go on as long as the U.S. believes that its target lists are going to need to continue to be serviced. Clearly, we're striking counter-force targets, the military targets. We're striking command and control. The Israelis are going after the leadership. So I think we're going to continue to strike those target lists as long as we believe that our purposes will be served, our objectives will be served by that. With regard to the region, for many years, we've been working with our partners and allies in the region to have a networked missile defense, air defense and missile defense capabilities. And so many of those countries have similar capabilities to ours, the THAAD, the Patriot. Our destroyers in the region have the SM-3, have capabilities to engage ballistic missiles across the region, as do our partners. So I think we're going to want to support our partners as best we can. The Iranians not surprisingly, went into horizontal escalation immediately, attacking U.S. bases around the region. But we also want to continue to support our allies against one of the really great threats that Iran has, apart from its nuclear program, and that's the destabilization of its support to terrorism, because of its support to terrorism. And there are multiple Iranian proxy groups in Iraq and other places across the region offer a destabilizing threat to our partners in the region. So we're going to be supporting them in counterterrorism. We'll be supporting them in countering ballistic missiles. And we'll continue to service our target lists until we've accomplished our objectives.
General, I want to ask you about those proxy groups and about Iran's response and Iran's military capabilities right now. Obviously, we've got Hezbollah, Hamas, we've got the Houthis, but it's unclear how much of a stockpile left after, these back and forths we've seen in the past year between Israel and Iran, they have of rockets, intermediate and short range weapons. And that was one of the sticking points of these negotiations is the U.S. always wanted those on the table. They wanted Iran to pledge to get rid of those completely. And that was a non-starter for Tehran as well. Do we have any idea? We've talked about what the U.S. capabilities are and how long the U.S. could last in this. Do we know how long Iran can fight back at some sort of level that is dangerous to the U.S. and allies?
Yeah, I think we should expect that the Iranians are going to deplete their missile and rocket inventories in retribution, in counterattacking the American attack. And they'll attack across the region. They'll attack American forces in our Arab states. They may go for the Arab capitals themselves. They're quite vulnerable. And the Arabs have some capacity to defend themselves. But again, we've networked this as much as we can. So I don't think we know exactly how many missiles and rockets the Iranians have. And there is a difference between the two. The missiles are guided. The rockets are ballistic. But the Iranians have a really formidable arsenal of those capabilities. And I believe that we'll see them striking as much as they can for as long as they can. Remember, their capacity to project any legitimacy to their people is going to be how they appear to be defending Iran from the Americans and from the Israelis. And the moment that it appears that the Iranian skies are wide open, and by and large they are wide open from the previous strikes, taking out their air defense capabilities, and it appears that the Ayatollahs are unable to defend Iran as an entity, they become illegitimate very quickly. And the people on the street, we know for a long time, have believed that this regime has got to go. And I think one of President Trump's objectives here is to create the conditions whereby the popular support to the regime can ultimately overcome the regime itself.
Retired General John Allen, thank you very much. And our thanks to Michael Allen as well for helping us piece together what's happened here and what the likely path is going forward. And of course, top of mind for us as well is what this means for the global economy, what it means for markets. It is a Saturday, but a lot of thought going into what's going to happen on Monday morning when markets begin trading once again. Tom Keene, anchor, of course, of Bloomberg Surveillance, joins us here now on set. And Tom, at a moment like this, you think of haven assets. Of course, you think of oil as well. I'm curious what you're looking at, what you're thinking about here on this Saturday morning.
What I'm looking at is Twitter, a feed out of Australia saying Dubai is shut down, which is no surprise when you know the proximity to Iran, but it is going to be disruptive to all the different logistics and systems that we have. It doesn't start Monday morning. If you're in the business, Monday morning is 5 p.m. Sunday night. Yeah. And at 5 p.m. Sunday, we'll begin to get a very good look at Brent crude opening in London. That'll be a key thing. There's speculation out there. I don't want to give any quote of a number, but the $100 number comes up, closing at $73 on Brent crude. Where will that go? We'll have to see, and we have time to work that out for the London opening. But to your flight to haven idea, with the 10-year yield well under the 4% level, I have to say, when in doubt, follow the Swiss franc. And that will be the meter here, particularly for the continent of Europe.
That classic haven asset. And Christina, we've seen OPEC Plus indicating that perhaps they could boost production in light of what happened here. Tom, I'm curious, we've seen markets so inured to these big geopolitical events lately. Venezuela, Iran back in June. What do you make of that, the complacency that we've seen in markets surrounding events like this? I think
we're benumbed. There's no question about it. I have the clearest memory of being in the Bloomberg TV control room for Iraq, and we had an old National Geographic atlas, and I opened it up and I said, you've got to be kidding me. What's the size of Iraq to Iran? Iran is 5 Frances. It is the size of 5 Frances. It's like, off the top of my head, Iraq is a quarter of the geography of Iran.
But it's not just Iran's oil supply, right? Because if this is a protracted conflict, we've seen Iran strike out against U.S. allies. We've seen them or their proxies hit Saudi facilities before. Could it be a bigger issue? And listening to the president say this could be a prolonged conflict, are the markets more likely to react to that than they would have if it were a targeted strike?
We have to see. I don't have any speculation on that. One of the great series I saw in these early hours of this was Michael McFaul, David, you know well, and he said, okay, this is going to be only from the air. It's just I'm traipsing on Joe Matthew's territory here. But the question here that you have is, where's the boots on the ground? And there seems to be no plans for that at all.
Tom, we'll get your perspective here over the course of the morning. I know during our special coverage here on our debut of Bloomberg This Morning, Christina, suffice to say, not what we had planned, but well positioned to cover.
It was not, but this is why we're here
yes.
on the weekends, and we want to bring you everything you need to know as these stories unfold. So stick with us.
Yes. So Tom Keene, anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance, with us. We're going to go back to Joe Mathieu and Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here in just a few moments. Again, recapping the news of this morning, we have the U.S. launching strikes in concert with Israel on Iran, and as the supreme leader of that country promised, we've seen this escalate to a wider conflict in the region. Missiles are flying across the Middle East. We've heard from our colleagues in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv rather, and Dubai about what's been happening there. A lot of anxiety, Christina, about what's to happen
Iran
next.
saying anything is on the table this time. There are no red lines. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the U.S.? What does that mean for the Middle East? We'll have more in the next hour. That's starting right now. Stick with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. This is Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
It is 8 a.m. and of course we're covering a lot of breaking news this morning out of the Middle East. The U.S. taking extraordinary strikes on Iran. We have a statement from the president that he posted in the early morning hours. We're going to have news, reports, analysis over the course of this morning, as we will every weekend, Saturdays and Sundays from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, streaming on the Bloomberg Business app and at Bloomberg.com as well. And Christina, suffice to say, we were both awoken early by all of this news.
Quite early. This was not quite the show we had planned today, as we just mentioned, but look, this is why we're here. This is why our teams are in, and this is one of the great things about being at Bloomberg is people were awake all night. People were online immediately and reporting this out. I was up starting at about 1:30. I think you were shortly thereafter us. We want to get to all of this, and first we're going to go to Lisa Mateo, who's going to catch us up on the headlines from the last hour. Lisa, what do we know?
Well, President Donald Trump saying that a massive operation was underway, and that's to ensure that Tehran does not have access to nuclear weapons. Now, he said the military operation, it began after Iran refused to renounce nuclear weapons. Both he and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on Iranians to overthrow the regime. Here's what we know. So several large explosions reported in the capital, Tehran. Iran quickly retaliated a wave of missiles, drones targeting U.S. bases and interests in the Middle East, and that includes the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. It said an American base in the country had come under attack as well, and Qatar and the UAE, they reported interceptions into their territory. Want to also point out U.S. embassies in Bahrain and Qatar, they have issued shelter-in-place orders for all their personnel, but also for U.S. citizens that are in the area. Several countries in the region also temporarily closing that airspace, and that's disrupting commercial flights in the area. Also want to point out oil as well. Sources telling Bloomberg OPEC Plus is now consider a large supply increase when key members, they are meeting on Sunday. Quick note on the blog, this headline coming across: residents in Dubai report sounds of blasts. And also to give a sense of the scale of U.S. and Israeli strikes, Iran semi-official Mehr news agency says that they targeted more than 20 of the country's 31 provinces. David and Christina, no word on if or when the president will speak, but we'll definitely keep you updated on that.
Thank you, Lisa. And we're actually getting an email from our colleague, Joumanna Bercetche, over there, who says that they can hear, she says she heard the last strike happening in UAE. And she says there's reports of more strikes in UAE and Qatar. We are going to go back overseas here shortly. But first, we want to play you some more of the sound from that startling, about 8-minute statement the president dropped on social media this morning. Again, he didn't call the press pool. He didn't notify everyone. We talked to our reporter in Mar-a-Lago, and she said she found out when the rest of the world did. Posted online. Among some of the many remarkable things in that statement, statement, including a declaration of war against Iran and a call for regime change. The president also said this campaign could cost American lives.
The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now. We're doing this for the future, and it is a noble mission. We pray for every service member as they selflessly risk their lives to ensure that Americans and our children will never be threatened by a nuclear-armed Iran. We ask God to protect all of our heroes in harm's way, and we trust that, with his help, the men and women of the armed forces will prevail. We have the greatest in the world, and they will prevail. To the members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the armed forces, and all of the police, I say tonight that you must lay down your weapons and have complete immunity, or, in the alternative, face certain death. So, lay down your arms. You will be treated fairly with total immunity, or you will face certain death. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. For many years, you have asked for America's help, but you never got it. No president was willing to do what I am willing to do tonight. Now you have a president who is giving you what you want. So let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach. This is the moment for action. Do not let it pass. May God bless the brave men and women of America's armed forces. May God bless the United States of America. May God bless you all. Thank you.
The last 2 minutes of that extraordinary statement from the President of the United States released on Truth Social early this morning, well before dawn. Our coverage spans the globe, and I'm going to bring in Dan Williams, Jerusalem-based correspondent for Bloomberg News, along with Joumanna Bercetche, the anchor of Horizons on Bloomberg Television, Matthew, the anchor of Balance of Power, and Jeff Mason, White House correspondent, with us on set here in New York. Joumanna, we were just talking about your current circumstance, the fact that you've been hearing these strikes where you're sitting. I want to go to that entreaty from the President of the United States there at the end, urging Iranians to lay down their weapons. I should point out here, these are airstrikes, and one wonders what the logical next steps would be were one to do that on the ground in Iran. And I'm curious how you were thinking about that. The president calling for Iranians effectively to rise up, calling on the Revolutionary Guard.
For those who do lay down their weapons.
But what mechanisms in place to do that? Talk about that challenge, if you would, Joumanna, in these next few hours and days.
Yeah, well, it's a huge challenge. And I think from what we can gather, just the retaliation that all of these Gulf states have seen and witnessed over the last few hours suggests that the Iranian regime isn't going to go down quietly. They've been readying themselves for the real possibility of military action. They have responded very quickly. Remember, in the 12-day Iran-Israel war, it took them a couple of days to calibrate their response. This time, they were ready to go. And they have targeted multiple countries. I will tell you, I'm sitting here in Dubai, and 15 minutes ago, I heard a couple of blasts, and it seems as though they're not sparing any Gulf states insofar as the U.S. has assets in those countries. So we're talking about the UAE, we're talking about Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq. All of these countries are involved. So it has become a regional war. And what we know from authorities in all of these countries is that most of the missiles and drones have been intercepted. So there don't appear to be any civilian casualties from the strikes themselves. There has been one casualty in Abu Dhabi on back of shrapnel. But that is the bigger issue here, because a short while ago, it was reported that the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, actually did make a call to his counterparts in all those countries and warned them about them allowing the U.S. to use use their bases to launch further strikes on Iran. So this would suggest that Iran are intent on retaliating. Now, when it comes to the demonstrators, I mean, you have to rewind back a month ago. There was an uprising, but it was brutally put down. And there are unofficial numbers that have come through. We don't know the exact death toll, but the numbers put forward by human rights agencies suggest that 30,000 people, more than 30,000 people were killed in these demonstrations. So there is a wariness, I think, in Tehran amongst the population, and a real question as to what exactly the U.S.'s assistance actually looks like, and whether the focus here is to target, once again, military infrastructure, perhaps key individuals within the Iranian regime. But in terms of actual support on the ground, what does that look like? Because once again, the stakes are very high. And this is an Iranian regime we spoke about in the prior hour that is very intent on its own survival. It's an existential threat to them, and they will not go down easily.
And Iranian expats I've spoken to recently in the U.S. who despise this regime with every fiber of their being still have family in Tehran. I talked to a woman who said her family, she hadn't spoken to them in days during the last round of strikes because they had gone to the mountains to try to hide from these air assaults. So these are the people the Trump administration is trying to appeal to, but at the same time, these are the people who are being put in harm's way, as well as our colleagues and friends and other people throughout the region. Dan, I understand you are now outside and safe. I hope you've emerged from a shelter. I'm wondering if we're hearing any more from the Israeli government this morning. I reached out to the embassy here and they said they're not speaking yet. I'm wondering if you're hearing anything on your side of the world.
As of now, no. There have been procedural updates, for example, from the transportation minister about conditions at Israel's airports. The Israeli airspace is closed, as are the airspaces of other relevant countries in the region. That obviously will affect air traffic, travel, and the like. There have also been call to shelters very regularly, usually divvied up by sector, by city, by community, by part of the country. The Israelis have been weathered to such missile attacks going back all the way to 1991, the Gulf War. And over those 3.5 decades have been developing a very sophisticated system that really homes down to the areas likely to be affected by any specific launch. So basically, if you are in the line of fire where you happen to live, or potentially in the line of fire for debris that could emerge for an interception of a missile above where you are, a missile intended for another part of the country, you'll receive a timely warning to go down to shelters. So that's happened already 6 times since this really blew up at just past 8 a.m. this morning, just past 10 in the Gulf. And we've been seeing that repeatedly. I think part of the reason the Iranians have succeeded, apparently, in scoring strikes in those Gulf targets, as Joumanna alluded to, comes down as much to range as anything else. Israel is well over 1,000 kilometers away. Those Gulf targets are in some cases just a few hundred kilometers away from the Iranian launch points. That means there's far less time to prepare for those incoming missiles, to intercept them, to mount an interception. Obviously, when you're across the region, as Israel is, and Israel has a very sophisticated defense array system, then it's easy to track those missiles and see them coming. I expect after Prime Minister Netanyahu put out that recorded message, very close to President Trump's message. In fact, the content tracking almost exactly with what Trump said. The Israelis also calling on the Iranian people of all communities and sectors, to rise up and take hold of their destiny, now that the Iranian government is apparently receiving a drubbing at the hands of the combined US and Israeli forces. We won't hear back from him until, I think, nightfall, when the Jewish Sabbath ends here in Israel.
That's a really good point, Dan. I mean, in June, during that 12-day back and forth, we did watch the Iron Dome very successfully intercept most of those munitions. There were a few that got through, but for the most part, what you were seeing watching those screens was actually the interceptors going out and taking out those. Iran clearly knew this was a possibility and recalculated what they would strike and when.
Matthew, let me stick with this theme of surprise. And I know that you were listening, as I was, to Courtney Subramanian, who's with the White House pool at Mar-a-Lago, noting that she was as surprised as all of us by the presentation of that statement early in the morning. She saw it pop up online, as we all did. I'm curious about lawmakers and how surprised they were. I saw reporting earlier this morning from the New York Times that Jack Reed's communications director, Jack Reed, of course, the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was given no advance notice of this. One wonders about the so-called Gang of Eight, the leadership from the House and the Senate, the leading members of the Select Intelligence Committees as well. Any indication if they were given any heads up here that this was likely to happen?
We actually just have learned at Bloomberg News that the Gang of Eight did get a heads up on this, which did not happen, for instance, when the U.S. went into Venezuela to capture Nicolas Maduro. And there was a bit of outrage when Marco Rubio, at the time the Secretary of State, suggested that they couldn't trust members of Congress to not leak that information. And the Gang of Eight is quite well known for not doing that. These are the two party leaders in each chamber and leader and ranking member of both Intel committees. That would include Marc Warner, who is out with a statement this morning demanding a war powers vote. And it gets back to this idea of a prolonged engagement, which the president is clearly telegraphing. The Speaker of the House was also briefed, we understand, and I suspect that that came from the same place. Whether there's going to be a classified briefing for all members now will be the next question, and I suspect in the days ahead they'll be demanding that.
And Jeff, correct my memory, but I think that's a departure from when the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear facilities earlier in last year in the summer, because I remember hearing a lot of griping from Congress that members hadn't been notified. Maybe some Republicans had, but I don't think the full G8 was notified.
No, I think your memory is right on that. Okay. And just to sort of take a broader look or stand back look at that, you heard the president use the language and use the word war. Well, Congress has the right to declare war, and that could be another major tension point politically in Washington, the fact that the president, though some lawmakers may have been given a heads up, he didn't go and ask permission. He didn't ask Congress to get behind this. He went ahead and did it. This is another example, I think, that some critics would say of the Congress, which of course is controlled by Republicans, giving up powers that the Constitution gives them to the executive. That's been true with tariffs as well. This, of course, on a major foreign policy level.
And debate about the War Powers Act is not exclusive to this president. This was an issue for Democratic presidents. This was an issue for Republican. This has been, as long as we've covered Washington, this has been something Congress has complained about. But to me, the fact that usually when you hear presidents announce strikes like this, they dance around this specifically so they don't come into direct contact. What does it tell you about the power dynamic between Congress and this White House that the president is outright saying this is a war, it could be protracted, and there could be American casualties?
I think it's just another example of the strengthening of the executive that has happened under President Trump's second term. I mean, he has claimed powers in many ways that are not his. He has used executive orders to govern more so than legislation, which is not to downplay the legislative victories that he also had in terms of tax cuts. And that has been a tension point in Washington. It's been a tension point with certainly with Democrats. The question is whether Republicans, rather, as Joe was referencing earlier, are going to rise up against that as well. Certainly, I can guarantee you, if this were a Democratic president in office, they would not be standing for this. But that has been a hallmark
Therein lies the issue.
Has been a hallmark of the Republican response to President Trump's second term, is that they don't stand up. So will this be a line that they feel he's crossed? TBD.
Joumanna, you heard Dan talking about the alignment in those statements between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. I want to ask you about how effectively Gulf leaders have been able to make their case to President Trump in the run-up to all of this. We saw that inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace in Washington, D.C. Many Gulf leaders party to that and were present for that first meeting. I guess there is some inherent ineffectiveness here, but what is that level of communication, the quality of that communication like between Gulf leaders and the president right now?
I mean, you got to be thinking they're working on the channels. We just got a statement put out by the Saudi Arabian Foreign Ministry calling for an immediate de-escalation, saying that they stand in unity with their Gulf allies in the region, the ones who had been targeted. And for Gulf states, look, this is of utmost priority. De-escalation is of utmost priority. And I think, when it comes to the relationship with Iran, I wouldn't say that there's a huge amount of love lost between many of these Gulf nations and the Iranian regime. But that being said, for them, what is more important in the region, in the context of their own economic visions, because many of these countries are undergoing economic transformation, is political stability. And that has been a consistent theme. If you speak to the leaders in these various Gulf states, they will tell you that they don't want this crisis to spiral out of control. And viewers may recall that a couple of years ago, 2023, there was actually a mediation that was brokered brokered by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran to sort of restore diplomatic relationships, where both sides pledged non-interference in each other's affairs. And that was a big step. It was a big milestone in the region, because you may also recall that in prior incidents, Saudi Aramco facilities in Abqaiq were also subject to retaliation from Iran. So this time around, they've been working very aggressively the last couple of years to ensure that those type of strikes don't happen again. And yet here we are on a day like today, where every single US-based military base, or not every single, but every single country that is hosting a US base has been targeted with the Iranian retaliation. So they would be looking upon this with a lot of consternation, concern about what happens next, obviously pushing for a big de-escalation here, working those diplomatic channels. But it's unlikely at this point that things can calm down or de-escalate, because the messaging that's come through, at least from the Israeli side, is that this is an operation that's going to go on for days. And as long as that happens, you would think that also the Gulf states and their assets, the U.S. assets in the region, will continue to be targets.
I also wanted to update our audience. Courtney Subramanian, our White House correspondent in Mar-a-Lago with the president, updates us and confirms that we are not expected to get further remarks from President Trump today. Dan, I want to go to you and ask about President Trump and the relationship between him and Benjamin Netanyahu. This has been two leaders who were very close and then had a bit of a tiff. The bromance seemed to be over, and then it has reignited in recent months. The prime minister was recently at the White House, and sources were telling me Israeli officials were coming out of that meeting. The word they used was giddy. Flash forward a few weeks later, and we have this joint strike on Iran. Talk to us about that relationship and how much influence you think Netanyahu has over President Trump when it comes to taking action in Iran.
I think he has a great deal of influence. Indeed, there was something of a falling out in between the two Trump administrations. Famously, Trump, then out of office in Mar-a-Lago, used the F word about Netanyahu. He was unhappy about the Israeli prime minister being so quick to recognize President Biden's election win. I think that's all well in the past. I don't think there's any dispute. I think President Trump would be the first to agree with this. This is a president who really enjoys success and admires success. And I think after the catastrophe of October 7th, the way the Israeli government and military were blindsided by that Hamas attack 2.5 years ago, Netanyahu, a veteran prime minister, the longest serving prime minister, with his eye firmly on his historical legacy and also the needs of the country in the given moment, put his mind not just to turning around the situation in Gaza, but effectively bringing about revolutionary change to the Middle East at large. Israel went on the offensive on several fronts against other Iranian allies. Hamas has enjoyed Iranian patronage for a very long time, as has Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite groups in Iraq, certain groups in Syria until very recently, and then again the Houthis in Yemen are also aligned with Iran. And now Israel, with the help of the United States, are taking on Iran directly. So I think what's clear here is that Trump has been persuaded. It may have been by other forces, may have been for his own reading of history. He'll be someone who'll remember the Iran crisis of 1979, the Iranian Revolution, when the U.S. embassy was taken over and many of the staff held hostage for a long time. He will be aware of that. There are also U.S. allegations that Iran has been behind assassination attempts, or at least one against this president who survived 2 assassination attempts, active assassination attempts in recent months. So it would appear a combination of the counsel of the Israeli prime minister, a prime minister he trusts to get the job done and potentially to give him a solid accounting of the realities of the Middle East, and his own ideas about his historical place or U.S. priorities in the Middle East and how U.S. interests might be served by seeing a change of regime in Iran. It seems that they've coalesced in this day that we've seen, and also, as noted 6 months ago in June, they stress test this relationship with the United States joining the Israelis in what was then a surprise attack against Iran. The U.S. joined in, and now they joined in at the outset with the U.S. pre-positioning planes in Israel, which itself is without precedent. So yes, there is a very tight relationship between these men that goes well beyond a rapport to what appears to be a common understanding of the Middle East.
Joe, at a moment like this, one tends to look back on what happened in the preceding days. You were on Capitol Hill for the State of the Union, watching the president advisors come in.
That's right. That seems like 1,000 years ago.
That feels like 1,000 years ago. General Kane was there, of course. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, as well. In fact, we were talking yesterday, Christina and I, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, still having a plan to go to Israel over the course of this weekend.
They haven't pulled down that trip yet. It was announced yesterday.
I wonder how you think about that, Joe, the run-up to this. Again, I keep going back to this theme of surprise, but what you've observed sort of about the apparatus surrounding all of this. Yes, we've heard from the president, but the degree to which he's been engaging with, and we've heard from his advisors on national security, defense, and diplomacy.
Yeah, and of course, at that point, when we were in the Capitol for State of the Union, the storyline was one of optimism, that they were gearing up for talks on Thursday. President said 10 to 15 days. By the way, this is 10 days on the spot. I'm not sure if you guys noticed that, which is kind of interesting. But you know,
and
Marco
not that
Rubio.
Much about Iran in the State of the Union.
That's also very true, and really no new insight into justification. It certainly wasn't amounting to what we heard in this video overnight. Of course, they clearly knew this, and he had a briefing by the CENTCOM commander on Thursday. Little did we know that was probably a briefing about how the attack was ready to go. Look, this is going to play differently with different members of the cabinet. You point out Marco Rubio, reminding everyone of the tension between Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance as the potential heir apparent of this president and of MAGA. This is going to be very difficult for J.D. Vance to telegraph publicly. He's going to have to support this, obviously, as a member of the administration. But to make this an America first, we need to do this now as a domestic issue for him, knowing that he wants to run in 28, it's going to be tough.
Jeff, I want to play you a bit more sound from the president's remarks this morning. No, apologize. We've heard the president's remarks this morning, but I want to play you sound from the president speaking yesterday in Corpus Christi, Texas. Because listening to what he said during the State of the Union, listening to the messaging up into this speech, as we were all trying to read the tea leaves last night, when I heard this, I thought, uh-oh. So let's play this, and you can give us your reaction.
They don't want to quite go far enough, and it's too bad. Look, we've been playing with them for 47 years, and that's a long time. They've been blowing the legs off our people, blowing the face off our people, the arms. They've been knocking out ships one by one. But every month there's something else. So you can't put up with it too long. We're not happy with the negotiation. They just don't want to. They don't want to say the key words. We're not going to have a nuclear weapon.
Was that the president tipping his hat there for the people who were listening? And what are the ramifications for this as we look at the bigger geopolitical strategy? I'm talking about potential conflicts like China, Taiwan ahead of the president's visit to China, and then, of course, Russia and Ukraine. Does this impact that?
Sure. So, number one, I think he probably was telegraphing it, and I think it's interesting as well because this is a president who has made clear almost from day one that he's interested in getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And yet he's also a president who is very, very interested in using the forces that are available to him in terms of military power. And he's certainly done that now in Iran. On the broader geopolitical ramifications, I thought it was very interesting to hear earlier what Russia's reaction to this.
Right.
I'm sure some would call that very rich, to have Russia saying that this is an unprovoked attack and not in line with international norms, considering the fact that Russia, of course, invaded Ukraine. But that, again, that does have ramifications for this. How does that change this administration, the Trump administration's ability to form a peace deal there, which, of course, President Trump has said he wants? You rightly said the president is going to China in about a month. There's always this sort of threat or concern of China potentially invading Taiwan. What kind of message does a United States strike on another country, in this case Iran, send to China in terms of whether that would be accepted or acceptable?
Our colleague Tony Halpin, who heads up our Russia coverage, making a very good point in light of the statement that you just mentioned there, that what this showcases, in fact, is the reduced capacity of Russia and Vladimir Putin to defend its longstanding allies in the Middle East. Joe, I wonder what you think about that. We have seen, certainly with Iran, the damage to a lot of its proxies in the region, and Russia for so long was a patron of a lot of these countries, Iran chief among them, in supporting them against the prospect of this kind of aggression.
And we saw this in Syria. You know, it was one of the big reasons that regime couldn't hold on, is it just Russia didn't have the bandwidth to support that regime as much as they used to. I remember when I was there quite a few years ago, there were pictures of the Ayatollah, of the IRGC leaders all over that area, and that's not there anymore.
Well, it really just reminds us of the disruption in world order that we've seen just in the president's first year in this second term. There's a lot of overlap here, as you're pointing out, and to get back to what Jeff said, how this impacts a potential peace deal around Ukraine, the way that it may be informing the Chinese when it comes to Taiwan, are huge questions right now. We haven't even brought up Greenland since we came on the air this morning.
It's one of the few times you and I have not discussed Greenland while sitting next to each other, Joe.
I want to go to the gentleman from the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts. That's Jake Auchincloss, who, of course, had a tour at Harvard University before he was a commissioned Marine and is now in the Marine Reserves. Congressman, thank you very much for the time on this very eventful Saturday morning. And I want to just get your reaction first. A question that we've been posing to a lot of our guests is sort of how they found out about this. And I wonder if you could kind of walk us through that and give us your sense of what happens next in the crucible of Congress. We know that there are these votes scheduled to happen on war powers. What teeth, what might does Congress have to bring to bear here, like what's happened over the last few hours?
Good morning. Thanks for having me back on. The way I should have found out about this as a member of Congress is the president coming to Congress to request an authorization for the use of military force, and the people's representatives debating in plain view of the American public the merits of airstrikes, the nature of Iranian self-determination and risks and benefits thereof. The way I actually found out about it is, like everybody else this morning, was opening the headlines and seeing that a reckless commander-in-chief had started a war of choice without congressional authorization and without explaining the strategic endgame. This is going to be tactically overwhelming. America does have air dominance above 10,000 feet in Iran, but it's strategically open-ended. And Congress is going to have to answer the questions that this president is asking.
Do you think this was an illegal action by the president?
Yes, he does not have authorization to do this. Under the War Powers Act, the only way that a president can commit U.S. forces into hostilities is if there is an imminent threat to the U.S. homeland. There is no imminent threat to the U.S. homeland from the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is a brutal regime that has immiserated and repressed its own people. It is absolutely a threat to U.S. forces in the Middle East and, of course, to our allies in the Middle East, but it is not an imminent threat to the U.S. homeland. And if this president wants to make the case that America should use its aerial dominance to take out nuclear or ballistic assets, he has to come to Congress for that.
Congressman, I'm going to assume that you've watched the president's statement, all 8 minutes of it, and there is that part at the end when he raises the potential of there being loss of U.S. life as a result of all of this. I mentioned your military background, the fact that you're a reservist. How did that particular part of that statement resonate with you as you think about the president now, I guess, post this, having to justify the action to the American people and certainly to the military as well?
The American troops deserve a commander-in-chief who has to lay out his rationale in front of their representatives. When you sign up for the United States military, you understand that you may be risking your life for the flag and for the Constitution, but you expect your commander-in-chief and your officers to follow the rule of law, to ennoble that risk that you are taking, and he's failing to do so.
I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned, what is the end game here? Is it clear to U.S. forces what the mission is here? Is that mission regime change? Does the U.S. still do that?
That's a terrific question. I can remember being a young lieutenant in 2012 in Afghanistan, patrolling Taliban contested villages in southern Afghanistan. And as a lieutenant, giving commands to my platoon and not being able to nest that mission statement up into a higher commander's intent about what is it that we're trying to do here. And when you do that, you undermine readiness and esprit de corps within the armed forces, and you make it harder for commissioned officers to execute their writ. This president owes a clear rationale to Congress, and then Congress owes the American public a debate. So, for example, with regime change, if that is the president's stated intent, he already lied to the Iranian protesters once. He said help is on the way. This time around, what is the nature of the support he wants to provide? Does that mean boots on the ground? Does that mean cyber attacks? Does that mean covert action? Does that mean overt action? Congress should have to debate that and justify it to our own constituents.
Congressman, we spoke to your leader in the House yesterday, Hakeem Jeffries, and he laid out a very good civics lesson about the role that Congress is supposed to play here and what he hopes will happen here in the days ahead. But there are, I think, many Americans, Democrats and Republicans, who are dispirited with the role that Congress has played in recent years. I think they might perceive it as being less truthful than they have been in the past, not having the kind of the fortitude to stand up to the president, to be an equal branch of the government. What would you say to them in light of all of this, and how do you see your party working together here in the days to come to respond to this?
The American people are right to be frustrated with a Congress that has sidelined itself in its Article I prerogatives. We are beginning to see Congress reasserting itself on tariffs, with tariff votes in the House on the Epstein files. And this is another opportunity, with a war powers resolution coming up next week, for Congress to reclaim its fundamental powers that the framers understood belong to the people's representatives and not to a chief executive. Ultimately, though, I don't expect Speaker Mike Johnson to be brave. What I do expect is for the American public to decide that if he won't be brave, they're going to send people to Congress who will be, and that Democrats are going to win the midterms, and we will hold this administration to account.
I mean, my question for you is the same one I asked Leader Jeffries. What exactly can Congress do? Is there anything you can actually do to stop a president who wants to take this action? I was going to ask you if you think some of your Republican colleagues will defect and join you on that, but it sounds to me like you're saying that's not really a possibility until the midterms.
Oh, I think some of the Republicans in the House may. I mean, this war powers resolution we're voting on next week is a bipartisan resolution, Massey and Khanna, Massey being a Republican. Mm-hmm. Now, whether it gets enough Republican votes in the House, one, to pass, and two, to compel action in the Senate, is another matter. But ultimately, I think if the American public wants to see Congress fully assert its Article I powers, they should never expect a bunch of congressional Republicans to be the courageous leaders that this moment demands.
Do you look at this in isolation? I recall after the U.S. went and captured Nicolas Maduro, there was a conversation that took place about whether what happened there could be a template for other parts of the world. And as you look at the president's kind of tendency or inclination for adventurism, do you see this as part and parcel of kind of a broader track? Do you worry that this is going to lead to more adventurism in the future? How do you think about this particular incident in kind of a broader sweep or context?
The Middle East is complicated enough. I don't tend to analogize from other regions because the Middle East has its own history and context that we have to be humble about. But just focused on this region, I think what is critical is for there to be a consistent bipartisan blueprint for how we're approaching Iran. And what I would posit is that two things are really critical. First, we need American air supremacy in that region. That is absolutely vital to American interests. So Iran cannot rain down terror from the skies with nuclear, ballistic, or rocket fire. And America does need to support Iron Dome for Israel, and ultimately, I would argue, a regional air defense system. Supremacy is critical in the skies. But number two is, we should be willing to offer a policy of mutual non-interference with Iran that says, you stop messing around in Syria, in Iraq, of course with Israel, with American troops stationed around the region, and we won't mess in your internal affairs. We'll persistently support the right of all people to have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to vote, but we will not attempt regime change so long as you stop messing around in other people's affairs. Congress could get behind that blueprint in a bipartisan way, and it could signal to moderate successors vying for power after the Ayatollah dies that there is a path to better relations and an improved economy. But that can't happen if we have one commander-in-chief offering, military action without strategic rationale.
Congressman, I want to ask you about these negotiations that were happening between Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Iranian counterparts in Geneva, with the Omanis kind of being the go-between. The question I've been asking this morning is, was the U.S. negotiating in good faith? Because we have reporting this morning that the U.S. and Israel have been working on this plan for, the word was, weeks. They left those talks, scheduling another round of talks, technical talks, to take place next week. Do you think the administration was really ever serious about finding a peace deal with Iran?
I think they were about as serious about it as they were about drug interdiction being the casus belli in Venezuela.
What does that do for U.S. credibility when it tries to enter negotiations elsewhere? I'm thinking Russia, Ukraine. I'm thinking all of these conflicts that President Trump does like to solve and does like to tout as a peace dealer.
The bigger problem for U.S. credibility is weakness, actually. This president in Ukraine is just fundamentally negotiating from a self-imposed weak position, as opposed to authorizing long-range strikes against oil refineries around Moscow, for example, as opposed to taking frozen Russian assets and investing them in Ukrainian defense industrial complex. as opposed to sanctioning Russian oil exports. He is just basically ceding to Russia's core territorial demands. That's our core problem, is the perception of weakness. Same thing in China, by the way. The recent national security document was a significant backpedal about our stance in the Indo-Pacific that the Chinese Communist Party cheered along. That's our core issue. The credibility issue is certainly there, but it's going to be there for so long as this guy is president. The weakness is more of a threat to national security.
Congressman, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time on this very eventful morning. That's Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. He represents the 4th Congressional District there. And again, Christina, this is going to be, I think, our focus in the days ahead, sort of how those two dueling war resolutions will be, how they'll play out in both houses of Congress.
Right. And look, foreign intervention is not something that was at the core of this party originally. We have seen it expand a bit, but is not something that is very popular with Republicans who are running again in these midterms and trying to keep the focus on the economy, on affordability, on those kitchen table issues that their constituents really care about. That it is unclear how long a prolonged, possibly longer than expected intervention in Iran is going to play with that domestic audience.
We are far from the affordability issue on this Saturday, it does seem. I want to go to Lisa Mateo now for some headlines. This is an eventful morning. Yes, in terms of foreign policy, there was some market news as well. Lisa.
There definitely was. And on a Saturday, too. Yeah, Berkshire Hathaway, they released its annual earnings, its annual report, and also, yes, that CEO letter from Greg Abel, this first annual letter. So let's get right to the earnings first. That's where I want to start with the headlines. Fourth quarter operating earnings, $10.2 billion versus $14.3 billion year over year. That's down 30% year over year. A big part of that was insurance underwriting profits. They slumped. Fourth quarter insurance underwriting operating income, $1.56 billion. Here's the big news, too. The company took a $4.5 billion impairment on its Kraft Heinz Occidental Petroleum holdings. Its cash pile, that fell to $373.3 billion. Now, as for the letter, I want to get to that because this is the first from Abel after taking over the helm from Warren Buffett, who led the company for 6 decades. He opened the letter with a tribute to Buffett. He promised to maintain Berkshire culture, continue operating the same way that they've worked for years. Buffett still does remain chairman. He's the largest shareholder. There is a shareholder meeting in May. Abel will be the only one answering questions. Buffett's going to be watching from the floor with the rest of the board. But these numbers closely watch because Berkshire's business, it does provide an overview of the U.S. economy. David and Christina, we're talking insurance to rail, energy, manufacturing, all of that. So that's why this is such a bellwether for the industry.
Oh, hi.
Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's Lisa Mateo joining us here on set in New York. And I guess this next segment is going to be best laid plans. I want to invite Katrina Manson on the show to talk about Anthropic and the U.S. government. Julie Ioffe, the author of the book Motherland, A Feminist History of Modern Russia.
Which I really wanted to talk about.
Yes, we were. And we will get into, I think, the complementarity between this and what's happening in Ukraine. But Katrina, let me start with you. You cover national security for us here at Bloomberg. We saw reports this morning of extensive cyber attacks in Iran as well. What are you thinking? What are you tracking as you kind of piece together what's unfolded thus far and what might be happening here in the hours to come?
Well, I'm thinking about Claude. Claude is on Maven Smart System, which is the operating system that U.S. military operators will be using right now. And, of course, we've had this huge discussion battle over what the role of Anthropic is in combat operations. They've been asked to leave U.S. government systems, and yet they're probably being used right now. In terms of cyber operations, I think it's a bit of a wait and see. Obviously, there's a sense that a lot will be supporting these military operations for sure.
Just want to put a fine point on this. That you say that could be used right now. Yes, I mean, in the run-up to this, they are so integral to the way that the Pentagon operates, other departments as well. I won't even call it peculiar timing. It's very strange timing that this would happen at a point where they're trying to use a lot of these systems.
And we were debating this in the newsroom, and I said, well, I'm assuming they can do this analog style, but there's a sunset where you think they're still probably actively using this software right now.
Wait, for the cyber operations?
For Claude.
Yeah. Oh, Claude is on the main military system that is almost used as a kind of theater battle management system. So it's not the key tool in any way, but it is used to analyze data, bring data together, and of course do what we all do with chatbots, summarize things and make things quicker. So it will. It's the only one that is on classified cloud. And, of course, the president gave them 6 months to get off, and they haven't had an official request to have that supply chain risk that Pete Hegseth talked about, the Secretary of War. But they are they'll be being used right now, and there's no reason to have them stopped. In fact, Dario Amodei, the chief executive of Anthropic, said, we want to continue supporting in any transition.
Julia, as you look at this, take us out for the big picture. We've talked about American trustworthiness in future negotiations. We've talked about how this could impact other conflicts as other world leaders watch this. We saw what happened in Afghanistan, and it had a knock-on effect in other places with other leaders, possibly with Putin making the decision to go into Ukraine. What does this conflict do for other conflicts around the world?
Oh, I think, watching this, I was reminded of the winter of 2021, 2022, when the U.S. was trying to engage with Russia diplomatically for months, going back and forth in diplomatic negotiations over Ukraine.
I was there in Geneva with Blinken and Lavrov when he still had his job. Yes.
There you go, right? And the Russians were saying, people were saying the Russians are negotiating in good faith. They're going to invade anyway. And the Russians said, no, we have no plans. We have no plans to invade Ukraine. We really are trying to, and Ukraine cannot be in NATO. They can just not be in NATO. We're negotiating in good faith. And it turned out, no, they were not. This was just a way to, like a box ticking exercise. They were going to invade anyway. And I can't help but be reminded of that this morning, that these negotiations, it seemed like, were, they were asking the impossible of Iran while building up these forces in the region, kind of like
buying time.
Yeah, but like Chekhov's gun,
yes.
Like if you put that stuff there, it has to go off, right? You have to use it. And yes, buying time, because of course our resources were stretched thin. The aircraft carrier Gerald Ford was in Venezuela.
We've been a little busy in Venezuela.
Yeah, and it needed time to get to the Middle East. So because the president wants to be seen as a man of action, wants to think of himself as a man of action. We've been 2 months without military intervention. It's a long time.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was talking to a Republican who was on the National Security Council in the first Trump administration, and he said to me, this is why you don't move your firepower to Venezuela, because you can't take your eye off the Middle East, because you always need that firepower in the Middle East.
I look at this statement that we're getting right now from Emmanuel Macron of France, Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer in reaction to all of this, condemning the military action that Iran has taken in the past, but noting we did not participate in these strikes, but are in close contact with our international partners. And Julia, on that point, I'm curious how you see what's happened here reverberating around European capitals. And again, we had hoped to bring you on here to talk about Ukraine on the 4th anniversary of the invasion there. Still very much Europe's focus, now having to navigate this world in which the U.S., not unilaterally, but with Israel, has gone about and made this attack.
Well, I think to me that was one of the hints that Trump was going to do this anyway, because a lot of our European partners and allies do still have contacts with the Iranian regime, do have a diplomatic presence in Iran. And we could have...
some act as our proxies and have for years.
Exactly. And we could have used their help in this if we had been actually negotiating. And I think this is yet another sidelining of Europe, another kind of trying to relegate them to irrelevance. I think this administration sees them as weak and feckless and probably effeminate, given how this administration tends to view things. And as for our allies, I think it's interesting that the Saudis came out and said they support this. The Canadians...
The Canadians as well. Mark Carney has been very critical of the president. I have a statement in front of me saying he supports the U.S. acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and preventing its regime from further threatening international peace and security.
So I think what I think is interesting here, Carney, you remember, he spoke at Davos and said, we're basically out of this. You guys have been using our alliance as a tool against us. We're out of Pax Americana, essentially peace, guys. But now they're on board. The Australians are on board. And I think what this is, the signal this is likely sending to Trump is, these guys talk a big game, but they're still going to support us anyway. And I think this is just like Venezuela reinforced this, just like his airstrikes in Iran in June reinforced this idea, is that he can get away with things. If he just pushes hard enough, people will go along with it no matter what.
Katrina, a basic question here, but squarely in your world covering cyber warfare and cybersecurity, we're focused here on the military might that's been brought to bear in the Gulf. Could you pull back the curtain a bit and just give us a sense of what the U.S. might be doing at this point when it comes to attacking infrastructure, cyber infrastructure within Iran, how that's playing out on another battlefield?
The way cyber operations have emerged is they don't deal the catastrophic blow. That is what people have been trailing now for years, that cyber could be a kind of almost the same as the 9/11 attacks. There is no cyber 9/11. What we've seen in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in the way the US used cyber attacks in support of Maduro, and I suspect what we will eventually learn has happened here, is that cyber is a precursor to military operations. It softens the ground. It makes it easier for kinetic action. That's, of course, what the US uses, the word used to suggest explosions. It makes those easier so that Iran finds it harder to respond, to launch its own missile defenses and also to launch attacks. Well, clearly they are launching attacks, so cyber can't stop everything, but that's the sort of way one would expect to see a supportive tool like cyber used. You'd expect to see both the NSA involved and Cyber Command.
I also want to ask you, in addition to cyber and military cooperation and diplomatic cooperation, there's also intelligence sharing, and that has been something that has been complicated by these kind of unilateral moves by the U.S. Five Eyes is under stress. Regional allies are less likely to share things with the U.S. They've even made statements saying they're not sure it won't leak. What is the current state of those relationships with U.S. Gulf allies? I mean, I think about the Jordanians in particular, have a very robust intelligence organization, and with our European allies who usually would be backing up an operation like this and probably aren't in this case.
Well, again, so I don't know if you were at Munich. What I heard there was Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing arrangement is under stress and under doubt. All kinds of intelligence sharing is under question, and this is the kind of thing we very much need right now, right? And again, I just think this is a very much America first, America alone, and you guys get in line. Like I think Marco Rubio's speech laid this out perfectly. Is like, here's how we're going to do this. If you want to get on board, get on board. If not, get off, losers. We're doing this anyway. And I think this is what we're seeing now. And because they're seeing the Saudis fall in line, the Australians, the Canadians, I think it just reinforces the message that, hey, this works.
Julie Ioffe, thank you very much. Julie Ioffe, the author of Motherland, the National Book Award finalist book, and chief foreign correspondent for Puck. Katrina Manson, who covers national security for us here at Bloomberg News. Thank you both for joining us here in New York as we continue to cover this breaking news on this Saturday morning, those unexpected strikes by the U.S. On Iran, the president issuing an extraordinary statement, which he posted to Truth Social. No audience in the room for those remarks, but indicating this is going to be a sustained attack. The U.S. is committed to it, and explaining to the American people there could be U.S. casualties as a result of this as well. Christina.
This is a social media president, and he has learned that he can speak directly to his audience without the intervention of press and without having to field those questions. But we will have lots of questions for lawmakers and analysts and our reporters. We've got coverage all over the globe. Stick with us. We'll be here. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. We are, of course, tracking breaking news out of the Middle East this morning. Strikes in Iran, a joint military operation between Israel and the United States. Iran has reciprocated. We are hearing of strikes close to or on U.S. installations throughout the region. Our colleagues in Tel Aviv have also been taking cover as alerts have been going off there since the early hours of the morning here at Wall Street Time.
Charting what this means, of course, for those countries, what it means politically here in the United States, and what it means for markets and the economy as well. And I want to bring in our colleague Daoud, who's a Bloomberg Economics chief emerging markets economist, joining us on this Saturday morning. As we think through what this means for oil in particular, what should we be paying attention to? I think in the run-up to all of this, there was a lot of concern over what might happen to the Strait of Hormuz, what it would mean if that were to be constricted, if oil couldn't get out. As you look at that map, the map function on the Bloomberg terminal today, and see those 200-plus tankers there in the region kind of wondering, as the heads of those ships wondering as we are what happens next, what does this mean for the oil market?
There's still open questions. So in the last 12 hours, I think we had four key questions when it comes to Iran, and I think 3 of them has been settled, and we'll have a partial answer to the 4th. The first question was, will the US and Israel attack Iran? And yes, they have. The second question was, will the Iranian government survive the attack? And the answer is yes, they have survived. The third question is, will the Iranian retaliation be significant, or or symbolic like previous wars, and actually they went for symbolic. And the last question is, what will Iran retaliate against? Will it restrict itself to US bases in Israel, or will it expand that to all facilities in the region? And so far, it has attacked US bases in the region, across the region, and Israel, but you cannot rule out attacks against all facilities or the Strait of Hormuz in the coming hours or days.
Ziad, I also want to ask you about sanctions. The Iranian economy has long been suffering under U.S. and international sanctions. We had the snapback E3 sanctions earlier this year. What is the state of Iran's economy, and what is the impact of a prolonged conflict like this going to do on an economy that is already under dire straits?
Well, there are two things here, I think. The first thing is when it comes to the Iran economy, its state is already dire, and that has led to protests in late December and January this year. But this war is different. War is not about the economy. This is, for the Iranian leadership, this is existential, and it's about survival. And it's about more military than economic. If they can survive the next few months, it's a question of not whether the economy is going to be able to survive this in terms of inflation, in terms of the currency, but whether they can survive the military attack and the counterattacks they're going to launch against the US and Israel and their allies in the region. That's the key question for Iran, more than the economy, in the coming days and weeks, I think.
Ziad, for those who don't know, how integral is Iran to the global oil market? We had those headlines this morning from a delegate, an OPEC Plus delegate, indicating that maybe production could be increased as a result of what's happened here overnight. When we look at the market holistically, how integral, how important is Iran to oil production globally?
Iran is significant, but it's not irreplaceable. So Iran produces about 5% of the global oil supplies, put to the world. But that's not the key issue. The key issue is the wider region. Once you just expand the war beyond Iran, you need to start thinking about Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait and the UAE and Qatar. We're talking about 1/3 of global oil supplies. If you think about one particular waterway, which is the Strait of Hormuz, that basically 20% of global oil flows goes through that. And that is very difficult to replace. Yes, OPEC Plus may decide to increase the quotas, but if these additional quotas are coming from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq, and they cannot exit the Strait of Hormuz to the rest of the world, they may not be effective in hedging the losses from this war.
We've talked a lot about what the impact of actual physical strikes could be, but what is the psychological impact on production here? We've already seen some oil fields shutting down preemptively. Could that have just as big of an impact, as producers don't want to send their ships through that strait at the moment? They're shutting down, pulling their personnel out of harm's way. How big of an impact could that have?
I think the physical sort of threats are more important than the psychological threat. Let's remember, this is not the first war in the Middle East in the last 2.5 years.
This is a good point.
The Middle East has been in an almost continuous state of war with unprecedented geopolitical escalation. Things that we did not imagine could have happened have already happened. And yet oil prices today, on Friday, they closed at $71 per barrel. On the 6th of October, 2023, they were $85 per barrel. So they're lower than the starting point. So I think on the psychology, I think markets are sort of getting used to the geopolitical escalation in the Middle East. The key question here is whether we're going to get physical disruption. And this is another test. It's probably the most serious test in the last 2.5 years.
Ziad Daoud, thank you very much. Ziad Daoud, who's a chief emerging markets economist here for us at Bloomberg Economics. And Christina, I just think about what he mentioned there, the fact that Iran's economy was in such a reduced state going into all of this. And as we talk about the rhymes that we see to past times, this has been a conflict when there have been these diplomatic negotiations surrounding Iran. A really huge distinction this time around in the run-up to these strikes was how up against the wall Iran was because of how reduced its economy was.
I also want to update our audience. We've got some new headlines crossing here on the terminal. Turkey is distancing itself from the U.S. and Israeli campaign after Iran threatened to target any country that facilitates those attacks. As you know, Turkey is a NATO ally. U.S. frequently uses some of their military bases. The NATO member, which shares a border with Iran, said it does not permit any of its air, land, or maritime assets, including its airspace, to be used for operational purposes in any conflict or war to which it is not a party.
What we are doing in part on this morning is kind of collating and going through the reaction that we're seeing here in the United States, certainly from lawmakers in Washington, but from leaders around the world as well. We mentioned with Julia Ioffe a few minutes ago the reaction that we've seen from Friedrich Merz, from Keir Starmer, from Emmanuel Macron as well, acknowledging what's happened here, but noting that they were not a part of these strikes. You bring up Turkey. I think that's going to be something that kind of sustains a lot of focus here in the hours ahead, how the world responds to what the U.S. is done here with Israel.
Right. The fear here was always that this was not going to be an isolated conflict. It can't be. So we are here, and we're tracking how the world responds.
It's coming up at 9 a.m. in New York. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now. Debut of Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York with the special coverage of what's happened over the course of the evening strikes on Iran. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is still Saturday, February 28th. There is really still only one story we're covering this morning, and that is Iran. Early this morning, before most of us were awake and before we came on the air, the U.S. and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran.
That's exactly right. And Iran, we've seen retaliate over the hours that have followed there. Those strikes are ongoing across the Middle East. I'm going to turn to our colleague Lisa Mateo now, who's been tracking all of it and has the latest headlines. Lisa.
Yeah, so President Donald Trump is saying a massive operation underway to ensure that Tehran does not have access to nuclear weapons. Now, we have both he and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They called on Iranians to overthrow the regime. Here's what we know so far. So there were several large explosions reported in the capital, Tehran. This also coming through. The Iranian defense minister has been killed. Iran quickly retaliating a wave of missiles, drones targeting U.S. bases, interests in the Middle East. That includes United Arab Emirates as well as Qatar and Kuwait. Bahrain said that American base in the country had also come under attack as well. Qatar, the UAE, reported interceptions in their territory. We did have some response from world leaders getting right to the blog right now, and joined the latest coming from Canadian Prime Minister Marc. He said his country's position remains clear that Iran must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. Want to get to our other top story as well for today, and that is Berkshire Hathaway. It has released its annual report, fourth quarter earnings, as well as its letter from CEO Greg Abel. It's highly anticipated. Want to get to the earnings first. The operating profits fell nearly 30%. It's Warren Buffett's last quarter as CEO. Now, a big part of the reason for that was a drop in insurance underwriting. Those profits had slumped. The big news also, the company took a $4.5 billion impairment. That's on its Kraft Heinz Occidental Petroleum holdings. Its cash pile fell to $373.3 billion. Now, as for that letter, it's the first from Abel after taking over the helm from Warren Buffett. He led the company for 6 decades. He opened the letter kind of with a tribute to Buffett. He promised to maintain Berkshire culture, continue operating the same way that worked for years. Buffett still does remain chairman and also the largest shareholder. There is a shareholder meeting in May, guys. Abel is going to be the only one answering questions. Buffett will be watching from the floor, also with the rest of the board as well. David and Christina.
All right, we'll be tracking that. We'll be coming back to it more tomorrow and on Monday. But right now, we want to get to the news of the hour, and that is this conflict in Iran. Early this morning, we saw a video drop from President Trump from Mar-a-Lago. No reporters were present. He's wearing a hat. He's speaking in front of a podium.
Just pause to say that is pretty wild. The video did drop, as we learned from our colleagues.
And our colleagues,
not any kind of formal way, and we have the President of the United States wearing a USA golf cap.
Correct. Our understanding is they didn't call the pool. They didn't get any kind of warning. Our colleagues telling us they found out about it when the rest of the world did. Really remarkable statement. The president says a short time ago, the U.S. military began a major combat operation in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Trump also said he tried to make a deal. We've got some sound for you.
We sought repeatedly to make a deal. We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces and no longer use their IEDs or roadside bombs, as they are sometimes called, to so gravely wound and kill thousands and thousands of people, including many Americans. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. This regime will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States Armed Forces.
That was the president in about an 8-minute statement he released early in the morning after those strikes began on or on the president Mar-a-Lago, his club in Florida. Covering this from vantages all around the world, here in New York, we have Joe Mathieu, the anchor of Balance of Power, alongside Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News. Joumanna Bercetche is the anchor of Horizons, Middle East and Africa. She is with us as well. Jeff, let me turn to you. I hear the president using all of these counterfactuals. Imagine if Iran had a nuclear weapon. You heard the president reiterating what he said in the State of the Union. They'll never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Level set for us here, if you would. We saw those strikes back in June, the U.S. and Israel attacking Iran to do away with that nuclear program, he expressing some confidence that, in fact, he had done that. What was the state of play? And as the president leaves Mar-a-Lago, travels around the country, has to sell the American people on what's happened here, how easy is that going to be to do in light of what the situation on the ground in Iran actually was?
Well, there's certainly some selling going on there. In particular, one of the adjectives that stood out to me was him saying imminent threat. Was there an imminent threat? Is that something that the United States is going to give more information on? I mean, they were just holding talks with Iran and had said that talks were going to continue next week in Vienna. This is also a president who pulled the United States out of what Christina referred to earlier as the JCPOA, which was the Iran nuclear agreement that happened during President Barack Obama's administration. He has said he wanted to have talks to come up with some kind of an agreement, but he's chosen now to go to war, and that's the word that he used. War is not popular in the United States. It's not popular with his base, for sure, because of the foreign intervention aspect of that. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, of course, this country is going into midterm elections in November at a time when a lot of Americans are focused on their pocketbooks, and the president is already a little on the defensive about the prices of goods. Now he will have to defend this war, and we'll have to see how well it goes. I mean, if it's successful, in some ways, like Venezuela was, that operation was quick, and he was able to paint it as a success, then it may not be a political albatross. If it goes on for a long time, which they are suggesting, or some people are suggesting it could, and if there are American casualties, which the president specifically said
himself there could be,
bingo, was a possibility, then that could certainly hurt him politically.
Joe, I want to ask you about this imminent threat language, right? Because it was a surprise to hear the president say war, because that is one of the enumerated powers in the Constitution.
Yes.
That's Congress's job. The way they get around that, the way presidents have taken these strikes, and this is all presidents, is to say it was an imminent threat to the United States. Does that argument hold water? Because during the first term, this administration tried very hard to make the case that Iran was collaborating with al-Qaeda so they could use the pre-existing AUMF authorization of military force and strike Iran then. Even their congressional allies didn't go for that the first time around. Do you think they're going to have any better luck the second time?
Well, it's a great question, because the selling is going to have to take place on Capitol Hill as well, not just around the country. And we're just now starting to hear from leadership, by the way, which I'll fill you in on in just a second. We heard last weekend on Sunday morning television, members of the administration for the first time talking about an imminent threat within days or a week. I believe Steve Witkoff said that they could have a breakthrough in highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. That doesn't mean they could put it on the head of a missile, but that's the first time that we heard that, and I suspect that we're going to hear it again, whether or not there's evidence to back that up. We certainly haven't seen it.
And it also contradicts their claim that they took out Iran's nuclear facilities in their last strike.
That's correct, yes. And so, he's doing a lot of work there. And we've been hearing the president say, as you just heard, we'll obliterate it again, that they've essentially had a chance to rebuild the whole thing since a couple of months months ago, right. So now that brings us to the idea of the War Powers Resolution. Did the president need the permission of Congress? We've just heard from leaders on both sides of the aisle, and the contrast could not be more stark. Hakeem Jeffries is calling for a vote on the floor immediately as soon as lawmakers get back to Washington. We just heard as well from Speaker Mike Johnson, who says, by the way, the Gang of Eight was briefed in detail earlier this week that military action may become necessary, which is slightly different than getting a phone call last night that we're going in. He doesn't even mention congressional authority over what the president is now calling a war.
Joumanna, get us up to speed on the state of play in the region as we talk about the political fallout here in the United States. There was the threat from the Supreme Leader that if this were to happen, there would be a regional war that would erupt, that it would be something that kind of would affect many countries in the Middle East. From your vantage in Dubai, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? How much is that coming to pass?
Look, I would say this is actually becoming what is turning out to be a really historic day. It is a fraught day. And I will just tell you anecdotally, myself, I'm sitting in Dubai and I have heard blasts. And there are stories of people rushing to the supermarket now to stock up on what looks like is going to be a protracted couple of days of attacks and counterattacks. So the feeling is one of extreme nervousness. I should also say that the airspace is closed as well in Dubai. In the UAE and other Gulf regions too have closed their airspace. So when we woke up this morning, I think there was maybe a little bit of a relief in the morning that nothing had happened overnight because the last time the U.S. launched an operation in the June 12-day war, it was an overnight military exercise. This time around, it's all happening in the middle of the day. You had the Israeli-U.S. joint operation in the morning, and then you had the subsequent very swift retaliation coming through from Iran, targeting most of these U.S. bases around Gulf states. And actually, just in the last couple of minutes, we've even heard that Saudi Arabia have intercepted missiles that were directed over the eastern province and Riyadh. Eastern province, let's pay close attention to that, because obviously that is where a lot of the oil is situated and Aramco facilities. Now, they say that they've intercepted the missiles that were directed at them. But again, I mean, the region is on a high state of alert. And I think the expectation is that this is going to go on for a couple of days. And also just waiting to hear exactly what and who precisely was targeted in those joint U.S.-Israel operations in the morning. We're still waiting to get more details on that.
Joumanna, we're also seeing a report across the terminal here that the Saudis say they've intercepted Iranian missiles in Riyadh and the eastern part of the country. You've lived there a while. I can't remember, other than that Israeli strike on that facility inside Doha, which was very controversial, was a targeted strike. I can't remember this many cities running for cover. This is something we see a lot in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. But when was the last time people in Dubai were worried about incoming fire? Is this a game change? And does this change the way the sentiment people in this region are going to view the United States?
Look, I think this is unprecedented times, especially for the citizens of the UAE who are used to geopolitical stability, economic stability. This didn't seem like something that could happen on your own home turf. And the fact that people are, anecdotally rushing to the supermarket, it's difficult to order food now on some of the food apps because people are genuinely concerned about what's going to happen the next couple of days. So it is most certainly a game-changing event. And I will tell you one other development that is quite interesting to note for anyone who's been following closely regional politics. A phone call was just held between the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE President MBZ. Those two have had a fraught relationship over the last couple of months over tensions regarding the future of Yemen and how to deal with the secessionists over there. It's been rumbling in the background, a lot of domestic coverage about how this sort of rivalry between the two sides is going to play out. This has actually served to unite all of these Gulf states together in their mission to help find an off-ramp and a diplomatic solution to what could easily escalate into a very destructive regional crisis. And I think, many of the leaders around the Gulf states are going to try their hardest now to see how an off-ramp can be offered so that the escalations can be toned down. It is, crucial to their own economic plans as well that this doesn't get out of control. And we haven't even spoken about the oil impact on the region too. I heard you speak about it in prior segments. So all of that on the table.
I believe we have Dan Williams with us, our colleague who covers Jerusalem for Bloomberg News. And if we do, Dan, I'd like to go to you and ask you what you're going to be watching for here as the Sabbath ends in Israel, as we expect to hear more from the Prime Minister about what's happened here. We talked about the level of alignment between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel. What more have we learned about Israel's participation in these strikes, and what are you listening for when the Prime Minister speaks again?
Well, it's funny you use that metaphor, listening for, because as we're speaking, a brace of jets is overhead. That has generally signaled a new wave of action. It's worth remembering that at 5 a.m. this morning, there was a surge of jet activity overhead. Now, in retrospect, we understand that to have been the setting out of those jets which carried out an attack, the opening attack on Tehran, that was then confirmed 3 hours later. So I think what we expect is, and the most pressing concern right now, to judge by Israeli media, and I say this with extreme caution because we haven't confirmed this yet, Israeli media seem to believe, Israel appears to believe, that the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, has been killed in this attack, in today's attacks. That would be a revolutionary development in this conflict, or counter-revolutionary, given that this man represented the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which transformed Iran and had a huge ripple effect across the Muslim world and the Middle East. So I think we'll be looking for confirmation from Israel of that, to the extent Israel, from its own distance, despite the power of its intelligence sources and its remote forensics, can confirm such a thing, or indeed if Iran would confirm that this has been the case and where things stand. Because I can tell you that when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which for a long time was the cat's paw of Iran when it came to Israel, a very powerful group, a group that had a missile array to rival many regular armies in the West, albeit very much downgraded by the war fought with Israel against it in the last 2.5 years, nonetheless retains some strength. The messaging, as we understand it, was that Hezbollah would stay out unless Khamenei would fall victim to an Israeli, or in this case, an Israeli-US attack. So if that is indeed the case, I think that is going to be the major new beat, the major new phase of this round of fighting. It's going to have a major long-term effect, certainly a short-term effect, into how protracted the back and forth of missile fire, airstrikes, counter-missile fire, etc., will last. Much will depend on to the extent and the duration to which the Iranians can keep mustering that cycle of fire, given how heavily attacked they are now.
I want to add the necessary caveat here. Dan Williams reporting that the Israeli media is reporting that the supreme leader has been killed. I should say Bloomberg News has not confirmed that news. What we have confirmed is that there were strikes in the neighborhood of where the supreme leader was, and certainly this is.
And reports of other high-ranking Iranian officials possibly being killed, but we've not confirmed those yet.
Including the foreign minister, who is alive. We have seen news of that this morning. But this, as Dan indicated, were that to be true, would be seismic news. And Joumanna, very quickly here, I'd love for you just to respond to that. I mean, this is the open question here. There was talk in the run-up to this of what kind of attack the U.S. might wage, if it might be one that tried to behead the regime in Iran, I think was the term of art that was used there. Your sense of what the significance would be, again, with the caveat that we're seeing reports of this in Israeli media, but Bloomberg News has not confirmed those reports.
Correct. But what we can take away from the early hours of this is that this time around, the operations have been targeting senior echelon of leadership, whether it is Khamenei himself, and again, no confirmation about whether he has been hit, but other members of IRGC too. And I think this marks a distinction between the U.S.'s involvement in that 12-day war when they went after specific nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. This time around, the fact that they are targeting senior intelligence officials, commanders, senior commanders within the IRGC, and perhaps even the supreme leader himself, suggests that the objective is not just obliterating or neutralizing Iran's ability to quote unquote defend itself or to launch attacks, but also potentially to change leadership right at the top.
We want to bring in Brigadier General Marc Kimmitt. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. General, I want to ask you, when you look at this, when we're talking about possibly targeted strikes, taking out individual leaders from this regime, can you talk about the intelligence and the planning that would need to go into those kinds of strikes? And if that is logistically possible, why that hasn't been done before now? There has to be a reason for that.
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, the amount of intelligence it takes, not only in quantity, but over time, to be able to know exactly where a specific person is at a specific amount of time, at a specific time, is just enormous. It would take numerous different assets and capabilities, both voice intercept, photographic evidence, people trailing them. It's just a huge, huge effort. I think one of the reasons that hasn't happened in the past is just the amount of assets it requires. But even more important is whether going against political leadership and military leadership is the right thing to be doing. In this case, I think going against the military leadership is exactly the right thing to be going to do. But political leadership, of course, gets you into the territory of regime change and the debate that surrounds toppling a leader of a sovereign country.
Is that the kind of intelligence that likely comes from collaboration, from partnership with Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency? The U.S. does not have a lot of physical assets on the ground in Tehran, but Mossad is the one that has been able to penetrate those installations better than the U.S. We saw that with the nuclear facilities, with that cyber attack Stuxnet years ago, and I'm wondering if you think that's likely, if this was the case and they were able to target individual leaders of that regime, that there had to be some sort of intelligence sharing between those two countries?
Well, I think there's intelligence sharing with a number of countries. Of course, one would consider that Israel probably is the primary intelligence colleague that we have in this. But I think it's important to understand this is more than just people on the ground. You've got to have all source intelligence. You've got to have not only people walking around, human intelligence, but you've got to have imagery intelligence, you have to have electromagnetic spectrum intelligence. So it's a mosaic of intelligence that comes together. The United States has the best overhead intelligence, of course, and in this case, it is commonly believed that the Israelis have the best human intelligence to prosecute these types of targets.
Jeff Mason, let me turn to you on that point. We go back and look at the groundwork that was laid for these strikes, the way that the U.S. has talked about them, the potential for them happening. And I wonder if you want to pick up on what the general was saying there just a moment ago, that the level of intelligence cooperation, the way that the U.S. is going about preparing for this. What do we know of that? What do we know of how these plans were hatched and vetted and put together in the run-up to this?
I don't have a lot of intel on the intel, but I do think broadly that it's not wrong to conclude, or it would be easy to conclude, that this is what they were after. I mean, if you have President Trump urging the Iranian people to step in and take over the government, he's clearly thinking that there's going to be an opening, right? And the opening would be created by taking out the leadership. So you're right to say Bloomberg News hasn't confirmed that yet, but the idea that he and that the U.S. military, in collaboration with the Israeli military, was going after these targets certainly makes sense based on what he has said. And I think it's also important to stand back and say that's a really big deal, you know, for any country, the United States specifically, to be not only launching strikes but trying to take out the leadership of another country is that's a big shift for U.S. foreign policy, and it's probably a defining moment in President Donald Trump's term.
Well, Joe, that's because this is a lesson that successive presidents have learned, and that's what we call the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you bought it, you own it. Mm-hmm. If this regime falls, does the U.S. then have to commit to some sort of peacekeeping force? How does the U.S. win the peace, which has historically been the much harder part of military conflicts?
These are the harder questions that should have been asked maybe before we started this, because the president may not have a choice at this point and consider, cutting off the head of the snake in this case. Look, this is something that, remembering this is the president who took out Qasem Soleimani in the first term, when you consider the way Israel prosecutes itself militarily. It's frequently going after people, not things or places. And in this case, this may have been the same. Obviously, we had done an enormous amount of damage to their air defenses in the strikes last year in advance of the strikes. So the question was, what are we going to target? And obviously, there are going to be some military targets, but individuals might end up being the real story here.
General Kimmitt, how do you look at these dueling tracks, the diplomatic and the military track, and where they led to in the end here? And we know of the closeness between President Trump and his longtime friend, trusted advisor, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. There was, I think it's safe to say, some happy talk after the negotiations that had taken place. Not effusive, but it seemed like those talks were going to continue. Generally positive. We heard from the Omani foreign minister yesterday on CBS News indicating that they were close to a diplomatic deal. Your reaction to that when you look at that in complement with what happened here, how do you think about the forthrightness or the engagement that they were having diplomatically as they were planning for these strikes?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note the happy talk seemed to be coming from Arakchi on the Iran side, from the mediators who were saying everything was going well. The one group that we didn't hear confirming that were the Americans. It is very typical in negotiations for the Iranians to come out after every round of negotiations and saying everything's going well, we're getting what we want, we're having a wonderful time. I think the Americans were very intelligent about being closed-lipped. So we really don't know how far things were coming along. All reports are, look, the Americans were very forthright. They gave up the concession on the proxies, on the ballistic missiles, and they focused, as demanded by the Iranians, only on the nuclear file. And it was very clear from what everybody was saying that the Iranians were doing their standard delay, deny, deceive, and that was going nowhere. And everybody knew that there was going to come a time that President Trump would run out of patience if no progress.
Oh, General, I think we lost you there for just a second. Joumanna, I want to ask you about something the General was just talking about, and that is that this was part of an Iranian strategy to say everything is going well, to try to outrun maybe the reality of how those negotiations were actually going and craft the narrative. We heard from President Trump this morning, and he said specifically it has always been the policy of the United States, in particular my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. Oh, we've lost Joumanna as well. All right. I'll forward it to our panel here on the table.
They're here. We can confirm.
Here's my sticking point here that is, it may just be all PR spin and who does it best, and I'll throw it to both of you. You can tell me. You have the U.S., you have the president coming out and saying this regime can't have a nuclear weapon. One of the big top lines from the Omani negotiators coming out of that was them saying Iran had agreed that they did not need a nuclear weapon. We've talked a lot about the U.S. and whether the U.S. was negotiating in good faith. Did Iran really mean that? Could Iran be trusted to never have a nuclear weapon? Or is that why the president is making the strike, because it just cannot be verified?
Well, certainly there's been skepticism in the international community for years about whether the Iranian government was pursuing a nuclear weapon or not. I mean, it's said forever that that's not what it was pursuing, that it wanted to have nuclear capabilities for peaceful purposes, for energy, and there's just been doubt about that across the board. Certainly President Trump has doubted that, and as we were talking about earlier, that was one of the reasons for the strikes last summer. Whether or not the seriousness of that statement or the negotiations changed in the last couple weeks, I guess is debatable, but clearly the president concluded it didn't raise to the level that he was wanting before making a decision to go to war.
There was a thought that this could be an off-ramp just days ago, following the last meeting in Geneva, that there might in fact be an off-ramp for President Trump to agree to a new limit.
A fudge. People were saying they were going to provide the president with a fudge.
There you go. That's right. Or maybe a taco, depending on who you ask. But we're going to get neither, it seems, Christina, because whether it was from medical research or energy, that obviously wasn't something that was palatable to this administration, but something that Tehran was hoping to codify in an agreement.
Palatable. I see what you did there. Joumanna, I think we've got you back. Are you with us? Thank you so much. I want to pose that question to you. I'm coming back to it because I'm curious what leadership there thinks about whether or not Iran would ever really have given up a nuclear weapon. There was some thought in the region that their forces, the IRGC, had been so degraded by those Israeli and U.S. attacks, that combined with sanctions, had really put them on the back foot to the point where they would never give up their nuclear program, but they would be willing to give up the nuclear weapon. Did we believe that was really on the table?
Look, I think what Iran were trying to achieve here was, one, preservation of their own regime and the structure that has existed since 1979, which is very pervasive amongst all elements of not just politically, but also economically as well. And the second thing is they absolutely wanted to achieve sanctions relief. And so from their perspective, they were willing to go to these negotiations so long as they would agree to terms that would still also not completely jeopardize their raison d'etre, which underpins their whole ideology, which is that of one of resistance and standing up to the threat of Israel, quote unquote, to the U.S. These are people who've been chanting death to America for decades now. And so intrinsic to their very existence is the nuclear program, and that substantial arsenal of ballistic missiles that they're sitting on, in addition to all of the proxies that they have been funding over the course of the last couple of decades as well. Now, what has happened over the last couple of years is on all of those fronts, they've seen major setbacks. You've seen it with the neutralization of many of their proxies in the region, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas or even the Assad regime. You've seen it with the huge setback that the U.S. sustained and Israel sustained to their nuclear program a year ago, and also the substantial hit that their air defense system and their missile system did take in that June war. Now, since then, they have been trying to reconstitute. We had a story up on the Bloomberg page a few days ago looking at satellite imagery, suggesting that there had been reconstitution efforts specifically at some of those key nuclear sites. They have been also rebuilding up their ballistic missile capabilities in anticipation of perhaps what could be a military attack from the U.S. and Iran once again. And here we are today. And so for them, having the ability to enrich a little bit of uranium is also very core to their ideology. They never suggested that they were going to actually concede to the U.S.'s demand of maximum pressure, which is a zero enrichment policy.
Dan Williams, what do we know at this point about popular support for an initiative like this one in Israel? We heard a bit about this from your colleague Ethan Bronner when we spoke to him a bit earlier this morning. Your sense of what the popular reaction to what's taken place here over the last few hours is likely to be in Israel?
Bumper stickers, graffito that I saw a while ago on the highway in English, conveniently aimed at Trump, American visitors. The message was Trump finished the job. And I think that applies to the majority of Israelis, given the sense that they are still on a war footing more than 2.5 years after October 7th, a Hamas attack that was astonishingly successful, astonishingly brutal from an Israeli perspective, the bloodiest day in Israel's history and the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust in terms of the death toll. As we discussed earlier, the Israeli government and the Israeli people mobilized not just to defeat Hamas and destroy it, and that's still a work in progress, but effectively to change Israel's position in the region such that the threat structure against it is profoundly diminished. So many Israelis will see this as, if you like, the crowning operation of that 2.5-year multi-front campaign. I'm hearing the warplanes behind me as I speak, and you should know I may have to cut out any second. We're expecting more sirens imminently. Apparently there are more missiles on the way. But I think, given the sampling of my neighbors in the bomb shelter several times, the sense of high spirits And if I could just open up here religiously to a religious note, and this is a region that's not short on religion, for many Muslims, this attack will be seen as a huge affront, not just because of the targets and the potential killing of the very top of the Iranian echelon, also because it took place during the holy month of Ramadan, which is being marked with fasting and prayer by Muslims across the region. For Jews, today's the Jewish Sabbath, and it's 3 days away from the festival of Purim, which historically has marked major turnarounds for the Jewish people. That's what many Israelis will be thinking about when they hope for success against Iran in this campaign.
Dan, thank you very much. A very important point there at the end. Dan Williams, please stay safe. Joumanna Bercetche, please stay safe as well. Both of them joining us from the region on this Saturday morning.
Thank you all so much. We want to bring in Ambassador John Bolton. Obviously, he was Ambassador to the United Nations and former NSC director during the first Trump administration. Ambassador, you are a longtime critic of Iran, but I'm wondering what you think about these strikes and how they were carried out and if they were legal under presidential authority.
Well, I think the objectives of the strikes are clearly correct and proper. Eliminating the threat of Iran's nuclear weapons program, its ballistic missile program, its long history dating back to when it came to power in 1979 of international terrorism, particularly against Americans, and its repression of its own people, which Donald Trump drew a red line against back in January and said that help was on its way and didn't come until earlier today. So I think the objectives are clear. This is manifestly within the president's constitutional commander-in-chief authority. The Gang of Eight were briefed on this on Tuesday. And if Congress doesn't like it, Congress can cut off appropriations. That's where congressional power comes in.
Ambassador Bolton, if you were to take that book off the shelf, John Bolton's plan for regime change in Iran, how closely would it hew to what we've seen take place here today? I'm curious just what you make of the means by which the president decided to do this, the element of surprise, so much as there was one here, and the cooperation with Israel on these attacks.
Well, I think there are a couple things that worry me. In his statement in the very early morning hours today, when he told the people of Iran that he was finally delivering, he said, now you have a president who is giving you what you want, so let's see how you respond. That doesn't sound like cooperation with the opposition Iran. It sounds like a challenge, and I'm worried that this campaign in the air, however important it may be for other reasons, has not been made clear to the people of Iran how they can use the time to seek defections from within the regime to try and pull it apart at the top. And I think it's something that when autocratic regimes begin to fall, people look around to say, I want to be on the winning side of this. And if they think the regime is in danger, they could well defect to the opposition. I think it's that coordination with opposition leaders, and it's a disorganized opposition to be sure, but I'd feel a lot better if I knew there was more to that. And second, I worry about the potential that after a couple, 3 days, Trump declares, okay, that's a victory, and now it's up to the people of Iran. That's not going to be enough. It's not a one and done kind of operation. These attacks, I think, as they destroy the instruments of Iranian state power, can be very effective, but it remains to be seen if Trump will carry through.
That's what we were just talking about. You break it, you bought it. If the U.S. does, in fact, destroy this regime, what should the U.S. set up in order to facilitate some sort of democratic transition in that country? Is that even possible, given the decades-long repression of civil society? Who leads Iran if the Ayatollah does not?
Well, that's going to be up to the Iranians, and I don't think it's up to us to set it. I don't buy the Pottery Barn rule. I buy American national security interests, which are threatened by the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and decades of terrorism. I think we should certainly help the Iranians in many different ways, but ultimately it's up to them. I think the most likely near-term outcome of the fall of the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard will be a military government, a secular military government, not the Revolutionary Guard, but the conventional military, that will hopefully then allow the Iranian people to have some kind of constitutional process to decide on what they want their new government to look like.
Ambassador, you have a somewhat unique vantage on the way the president thinks about these matters, and I'm curious what you can tell us about that. There was that moment in the statement that he published last night in which he kind of took past presidents to task for not doing what he did here, kind of saying that he had the gall and the might and the willingness to do what they hadn't been able to in the past, or the unwillingness to do in the past. I don't mean to have you be an armchair psychologist here, but what can you tell us about the way that the president has viewed this issue, and as you've seen it, perhaps his evolution on the potential for there being strikes like these against Iran?
Well, he didn't do it in his first term either, notwithstanding my best efforts to convince him to. I think if we had done this 25 years ago, the world would be a much better place. It always gets harder as time goes by. If we had done it before Iran's support to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi Shia militia, maybe there never would have been a Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th of 2023. Maybe the terrorist groups never would have had that capacity that Iran has given them over decades. So why has Trump come to this point? I am not a psychiatrist, and I'm not even sure a psychiatrist could tell you what's brought him to this point, because every argument that he made in his speech in the early hours of this morning were points that were made to him back during his first term. I can assure you of that because I was among those who were making them.
Do you think this is Netanyahu's influence?
Well, certainly Netanyahu has had this view for a long time too, but he made those points to Trump during the first term, and they didn't take effect then. That's for sure.
How do you think about the prospects of there being a wider war here? And that, of course, was the warning that we heard from the Supreme Leader before these strikes took place, that if they were to happen, we would see this escalate and escalate widely. And as we've heard from our colleagues around the region this morning, it sounds like that is, in fact, happening. Yes, there's been all manner of missile defense, but it does seem like this is roiling beyond Iran across the region. How much does that worry you? And as you talk about the president's capacity to stick with this as long as he needs to stick with it, how much does it worry you that he might have that impatience?
And if I may add on, David, what is your assessment of how much firepower Iran has left and how long they can last?
Well, I think they've been dramatically reduced both by Israel's response to the second ICBM attack against Israel. The Israelis responded in late 2024 and did a lot of damage between Israel and the United States during the 12-day war. Last summer, a lot of damage was done, and Iran's terrorist surrogates, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others, are pale shadows of what they were before. What we can see, apparently, is that at least some missiles have been launched against the Gulf Arab states and, of course, against Israel. El Arabiya is reporting that the Saudi government has said they will join the United States in responding to the attacks from Iran, and apparently Qatar has said something similar. You know, if the Iranians want to try and ride in the war, they're just signing more death warrants for themselves, I think.
Can I ask you to put this in a broader context here? We saw the statement from Russia this morning, a lot of whataboutism, but we've talked a bit about this over the course of the morning, the fact that Iran for a long time enjoyed the support of Russia, and we've seen Russia so greatly reduced by its adventurism in Ukraine and the fact that it's been marginalized on the world stage. How do you look at these two powers in complement, Iran and Russia, and what does that tell you about this moment and why this happened now?
Well, I think you need to bring China into the picture, too, because of its dependence on Iranian oil, despite our sanctions. Look, the Russians couldn't save the Assad regime some months back when the Turkish-backed forces swept into power in Damascus. Russia was not able to save Maduro. The regime itself is still in power in Venezuela. That's a unfinished business, in my view. But Russia has been severely depleted because of the Ukraine war, not enough to stop that war, but enough to make it very hard for them to go after their putative allies elsewhere in the world. The real question here is China, which was reported widely in the press in the past week or so as being on the verge of signing a contract to sell Iran anti-ship missiles, which are obviously of great concern to us. So this is just one more reason why acting now against Iran saves us from potentially even greater risk in the future.
Ambassador, before we let you go, we've seen President Trump go after the leader of Venezuela. We've seen President Trump now go after the leadership of Iran. It's still unclear how successful those efforts were. Why don't we see that same appetite to go after other autocrats who've caused conflicts? First name that comes to mind is Vladimir Putin. Why does the president have such a different approach with Putin than he does to other leaders around the world?
Well, he thinks he and Putin are friends. He also thinks he and Xi Jinping in China are friends. He and Kim Jong-un in North Korea are friends. Recep Erdogan of Turkey, they're friends. These other leaders were not so fortunate. But, you know, the effort to overthrow the government of Maduro, we tried and failed in 2018 and 2019. Trump's just getting back to, I think, the things that I was certainly hoping he would do then, and maybe the government of the post-Castro government in Cuba would be next.
Ambassador John Bolton, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate your insights.
Following on that from Ambassador Bolton, I want to bring in Marc Champion now. He's a Bloomberg opinion columnist, along with the director and senior advisor for the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's Mona Yacoubian. Marc Champion, let me start with you. You're out with a piece this morning focused on what the U.S.'s objectives were here, and to summarize the piece, the objectives were everything. I'm curious what you made of the statement from the president this morning. Just to read a little bit from your piece here. The U.S. has been here before. That doesn't mean it can't work this time, but one thing is certain: there is nobody in Washington who can be sure of where this war of choice leads. How did you process what the president said? As you rightly point out here, we've gotten mixed explanations from the president in the run-up to this about what the U.S. objectives were on the military track or the diplomatic track. Your sense of that speech, that statement from the president this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I was just struck by how many different goals he packed in there. You know, the one he was, you know, slightly, hedged on was the nuclear goal, which, but only because he had claimed during the last attack that the program was obliterated. So that was a little difficult to really major on this time. But nevertheless, you know, that was in there. Destroying the Navy, destroying the ballistic missile capacity, the factories for the ballistic missiles, and ultimately regime change. But to me, that's the key. You know, that if the U.S. was going to attack in a big way and wanted to achieve these things that it could not achieve in negotiation, remember that they did go and try to negotiate. They did say to the Iranians, we need a complete end to your nuclear activities. They wanted to also talk about missiles. They wanted to talk about proxies, and the Iranians said no. So that was fairly predictable. But nevertheless, what they're doing now is saying, okay, we're going to do all this stuff by force. But it only really works if you get regime change. And that is really the lesson of what has happened before. We had a very successful set of, in military terms, attacks last summer when the Israeli and the U.S. Air Forces attacked the nuclear sites and other missile launchers, etc. They took out a lot of the air defenses, which has made this attack much easier. The lesson of that is that we're back. We're back here doing it again. And why? That's because there was no regime change. It is the same regime. They have the same goals. They have the means in order to rebuild their programs. They rebuilt the ballistic missile stuff that was destroyed fairly quickly. That's really the key here. Either it works, in which case you get regime change, or not.
Mona, what's your assessment of how other regional allies feel about this idea of regime change? Because if there is a power vacuum, if there is a civil war, they're the ones who are going to feel the consequences of that first. I'm thinking Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, Oman, the Omanis who were facilitating these negotiations that apparently were for naught. Are you hearing from these nations, do you have any kind of read about, even though they may not be fans of the Iranian regime, fears they might have around it imploding?
Well, they are absolutely not fans of the Iranian regime, and you're seeing some fairly sharp statements come out of both Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with respect to strikes that Iran has already taken, retaliatory strikes on U.S. targets in their countries. But that said, I think there's no doubt that this is a nightmare scenario for the neighboring Gulf countries. This is precisely what they had been hoping against and had been working diligently behind the scenes in order for negotiations and diplomacy to be successful. I heard early this morning from an Omani contact who said this is the worst scenario that we had feared playing out. And look, it's still early days. It's really hard to say exactly how the various repercussions are going to unfold. But I think this is going to get a lot more complicated in the coming days and perhaps even weeks.
Marc Champion, let me ask you about the politics of impatience, presidential impatience. It's become kind of a joke as we try to keep track of or count how many wars the president says he's solved. But what draws all of those together is the speed with which he says he's done it. And I look at Venezuela. Christina brought that up just a moment ago. That was a major event that happened over the course of not even 24 hours, but 12 hours. And I guess we see in the aftermath of that the difficulty on the ground in Venezuela of plotting a path forward. You have an interim president trying to negotiate who she's responsible to, her party, the people in Venezuela, or the Trump administration. To what Ambassador Bolton said just a few minutes ago, that this is a president who's going to have some stick-with-itedness here in Iran going forward, do you have any optimism that he's going to have that in light of what we've seen in these other adventures he's had around the world?
Well, no, but on the other hand, he may not have a lot of choice. You know, that's the thing about starting a major war. This is not a special operation. You know, what you had in Venezuela was a commando operation. It could have gone very badly wrong in the way that the operation, ordered by President Carter went wrong in 1979 in Iran. That could have gone wrong. It didn't. It went very well. And I think that's part of the reason why this is happening now, that basically the president has had two, very successful military operations. The first in Venezuela, the second was last summer when they bombed the nuclear sites in Iran and they did that, successfully. We don't know exactly, that they destroyed everything, but, the planes went home and there was a lot of damage done. And I think that encouraged him to go ahead and have a go now. It's just that I am very dubious that he has a full understanding of where, how difficult it is to control events once you begin a large-scale conflict, and also how difficult it can be to end them on your terms.
Well, I'm wondering what your assessment was of the impact on Iran's nuclear program after that first round of strikes, because the president came out and said, we destroyed those facilities, we obliterated them. Nuclear experts I talked to were less sure. We're now talking about Iran having been able to build those back very quickly. Is that assessment accurate? And we also heard the president say there was an imminent threat. Was that breakout time that much different than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks ago?
I don't think so. I mean, I think surely the president said obliterated for his own political reasons last June. But by all accounts, the nuclear facilities did sustain some amount, if not significant damage. And more importantly, there were no intelligence reports suggesting that Iran was imminently going to have a nuclear weapons capability. On the contrary, the negotiations that were ongoing were in fact focused on whether and how Iran might be willing to compromise its ambitions, potentially even down to zero enrichment. Now, it's not at all clear that we were there, and indeed, by many accounts, we were far apart. But I do think it's very hard to make the case that there was an imminent threat of Iranian nuclear capabilities.
We have some lines coming in from the State Department. This is from a U.S. official. Secretary of State Rubio laid out the situation and consulted the G8 on, that's that Gang of 8 that we were talking about earlier, those top congressional leaders, in Tuesday in an hour-long briefing. And Secretary Rubio then made calls to all the members to give them a heads up ahead of time. They said he successfully connected with 7 of 8. One was unreachable.
We know John Thune, the leader in the Senate, was one of them, and he praised Secretary Rubio for the information that he got in advance of this. Marc, let me close by asking you about the gravity of what's happened here. So we've seen the president go to a podium at Mar-a-Lago wearing no necktie, wearing a white baseball cap with USA emblazoned on it, release a statement not to any press, nobody was in the audience, posted on social media, and here we are. He's not scheduled to speak today as well. During those remarks, he did talk about the potential gravity here for U.S. troops overseas. There could be casualties. How do you think about him in this moment? He is a president at war now. He used the term. He didn't call this a special operation, as you pointed out a few moments ago. He has characterized this as a war. How do you contrast that, again, the gravity of the moment with the way that he, yes, at a face level, is approaching this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it was a surprise. I mean, this is the way that, President Trump has approached these things. It is extraordinarily different from previous United States presidents. It's not my taste that's how I would like to have, my leader announced that he's taking the country to war. My preference would be also that he would go first to Congress and get permission for agreement for a war of choice, because, as was said before, there was no imminent threat here. Even if the Iranians had been able to reconstitute their nuclear program, the program we're talking about, it's a uranium enrichment program. Mm-hmm. That's the first step towards building a warhead and putting it on a missile. It's not. There's a distance between those things. It's important. The breakout thing is an important issue, but it's not an imminent threat. It's Trump. It's entirely Trump. I imagine that his base, likes that he thinks that image will work for him. Not to my taste, but that's who he is.
All right, Marc Champion, Mona Yacoubian, thank you both so much for joining us today.
I want to return here to markets and the economy, of course, a focus for us as we watch all of this unfold. And I should say we have some comments from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, right now, saying that UK planes are in the Mideast sky for defensive operations. We'll continue to monitor what the Prime Minister is saying there. Tom Keene, the host of Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio and YouTube, joins us now. And Tom, I wonder how you're processing all of this. You and I have been in the studio for major events like this one before. What are you thinking about? How are you framing this in that context through that prism of markets and the economy?
The markets will vote, and they're going to start voting not Monday morning New York time. They're going to vote with the trading of the Japanese yen, the currency markets opening 7-ish Sunday evening New York time. But even before that, we'll get a vote on Brent crude. There's a Dow 10,000 mark of $100 a barrel, closing at 73 on Friday. I have no information of if we explode up on the price of oil, but that will be the first marker people will look at. And the other one, Christine, is the Swiss franc. In all the things that David and I have been through, and this goes back decades and decades, the Swiss franc becomes the ultimate monitor.
When geopolitical events happen like this, what do you think historically matters more? Is it the headline, or is it something better? Is it the duration? Which do you think impacts more?
I think here historically is to look at the supply lines to a beleaguered Iran, and what is absolutely stark, and I know David, you've covered this, is the allocation of petroleum products from Iran used to be blended mix, a nice mix. Now it's, as the president would say, China, China, China. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the petroleum disruption to China plays in here. Nobody's talked about China yet. Maybe on Monday or Tuesday we'll have more about Beijing.
We talk a lot about how President Trump's policy impacts markets, but we know this is also a president who watches the markets and watches those numbers very closely.
Yeah.
How do you think those numbers will impact the president's policy? If this continues, those numbers start to look bad?
Always he monitors the stock market, and to see what not only the stock market here does, but a booming, say, Korea in a massive bull market. He will monitor the equity markets. I think the Bloomberg world will much more look at interest rates. A close on the U.S. 10-year yield under 4% is a big deal, 3.94%. Someone like Ian Lincoln at Bank of Montreal makes clear he's not worried about that for a distant 3.75. But will it be price up, yield down on Monday in the bond market? What will the spread dynamics look like? Obviously oil, but I'm going to go old school here and say watch the Swiss franc.
Few people here read as widely or as deeply as you, Tom, and I wonder, as the weekend unfolds, who you're going to be looking to for analysis. I think of Peter Cheer, who we often talk to at Academy Securities, who writes a lot about global macro risk. Curious what you have read, if anything, this morning that you would want to bring to the table. But beyond that, sort of who you're looking to hear from when it comes to markets voices, economic voices, who's going to give you a better sense here of the impact this is going to have going forward.
incredibly well-greased staff, all working on Saturday, came to me 20 minutes ago with the same question. First name out of my mouth. Folks, it was my book of the year a couple of years ago. Robert T. Kaplan, The Loom of Time, the view across the Arab world from Morocco all the way over to a Persia, which is not part of the Arab world. Decidedly, that one person I want to talk to right now is Robert T. Kaplan.
What about Bitcoin? I know the markets are not trading, of course, but we do have Bitcoin. It's been trading. I'm looking at it now. It's down about 1.5%, 64,000 about. What does it say about the risk appetite for digital?
To me, it's all we have right now to look at. And for it to break down under 64 to a 63 print, a 59,000 print, Lisa, I would assume would be a huge deal. I wish Katie Greifeld was here to make me smarter. But the answer is it's all we got right now.
Right.
But that will change as we go into the United States early Sunday evening.
Let me ask you lastly, Tom, how you look at this in complement with what has been driving the market over the last week or two. So much concern about the private credit space, so much concern about the prospects for AI being revolutionary or a bubble. How do you look at all of those three things in complement? What does it mean for those other two stories?
The news flow Friday was extraordinary. I thought I'd come in and waltz through a 3-hour show.
Your eyes were on London at the start of the show.
Never say it's going to be a slow news day. You know that.
It was unbelievable this Friday. Now we have these events, and of course we will hear. I thought Marc Champion was riveting there, but we will hear from the president. We'll hear from Secretary of State Rubio. There'll be other voices that will surprise us. I know, just working off the Bloomberg terminal on the phone, that the news flow, which you guys have tried to harness this morning, it's frantic. I mean, I've got 3 or 4 stories I can say, here's a news item, but I really don't have it properly sourced.
Tom, great to get your perspective. Tom Keene, the anchor, of course, at Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio and YouTube, on a very busy morning here, the debut of our show, Bloomberg This Weekend. We woke up to this news that the U.S. had attacked Iran, and we've watched in real time. We tried to piece together, as Tom said just a moment ago, how frenetic the news flow has been, looking at statements from world leaders, looking at statements from congressional officials as well. Christina, that's going to be something that persists over the course of this weekend. Yes, we will be back here tomorrow on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, streaming on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. More live coverage of the ongoing crisis at Iran tomorrow starting at 7 a.m. Eastern.
I'm Christina Ruffini. For David Gura and Lisa Mateo, thank you so much, and we'll see you back here at the same time tomorrow.